Before the world learned to fear the word Viking, Scandinavia was already simmering with ambition. The centuries between the fall of Rome and the first northern raids, the 500s through the 700s, were not an age of silence here, but of transformation. The Romans had come and gone. The great migrations had shaken Europe like a snow globe, and in the north, a new aristocracy was quietly arranging its swords and stories. Historians call it the Vendel period, but you could think of it as the rehearsal before the show. Imagine the Scandinavian landscape, then not yet littered with longships, but scattered with small, proud kingdoms. Each valley and lake had its own chieftain, each chieftain his own warband, and each warband its own patch of sky to defend. The graves they left behind unearthed in Sweden at places like Vendel and Valsgärde are like frozen frames from a film just before it bursts into color. Inside these burial mounds, archaeologists have found helmets gilded with animal designs, swords so richly patterned they seem to hum with vanity, and harness fittings shaped like dragon's boars and wolves. These were not crude barbarians living off fish and chance. These were people crafting a visual language of power, half art, half threat. If you picture them only as shaggy warriors in furs, you'd be missing the point. They were merchants, diplomats, pirates, and poets rolled into one. Their halls glittered with imported goods glass from the Rhine silver, from the Islamic Caliphate's garnet from India. Even before the Viking Age officially began, Scandinavian ships were sailing along Baltic trade routes, swapping furs, amber, and iron for the luxuries of the south. The Baltic, that wide gray mirror, was not a barrier, it was their marketplace. The Vendel lords, these pre-Viking elites, ruled through charisma and spectacle. A leader wasn't a bureaucrat. He was the best storyteller in the room, the man whose ancestors were gods, whose sword had a name, whose feasts were so grand that the smell of roasted meat alone might win him followers. To rule meant to give generously and to fight magnificently. In this economy, wealth wasn't hoarded. It was displayed, distributed, and drowned in ale. The greatest sin wasn't poverty, it was stinginess. This was also the age when Scandinavian society began to organize itself in the way it would remain for centuries, a tripod of classes balanced on the edge of survival. At the top were the jarls, the aristocracy landowners and military leaders who traced their bloodlines to divine origins and reminded you of it often. Beneath them were the carls, the free farmers, independent, self-reliant, proud of the calluses on their hands and the sharpness of their axes. And below all stood the thralls, the enslaved captives of war debt or birth, who kept the fields plowed and the halls warm. Yet even this hierarchy wasn't as rigid as it might sound. In a world where courage could buy you fame, a clever farmer could rise, and a careless jarl could fall. During the Vendel centuries, art and weaponry became a kind of communication. Helmets gleamed not just for protection, but to tell stories in metal. One such helmet found at Valsgärde depicts warriors dancing around a spear-bearing figure, possibly Odin himself. Another shows serpents and beasts interlacing in hypnotic curves, motifs that would later blossom into the famous Viking knotwork. Everything meant something. A carved dragon's head wasn't decoration. It was an invocation, a ward against chaos. And chaos was never far away. The migration age had swept waves of displaced tribes across Europe, Goths, Lombards, Franks, all distant cousins to the Norse. But in their isolation, the Scandinavians began to turn inward, shaping their own gods, their own dialects, their own sense of destiny. Language itself was mutating. From a shared Germanic tongue emerged Old Norse, the language that would one day give us Saga's runestones and words like berserk sky and knife. It was also a time of experimentation in politics. There were kings sometimes 2 or 3 per valley, but their power was fragile. Authority came not from bureaucracy, but from loyalty, which was earned one feast and one victory at a time. A king's greatest tool wasn't a law code, but a gift silver arm rings, imported wine, or the promise of glory in a raid. Lose that gift-giving rhythm, and your followers would drift away to someone more generous or more lucky. Luck, in fact, was a currency of its own. The Norse word hamingja meant both fortune and spiritual power. To be successful was proof that the gods favored you. To fail was to lose not just wealth, but cosmic approval. It's why early Norse leaders surrounded themselves with omens and symbols, carved charms into their swords, and carried amulets of Thor's hammer into battle. Superstition wasn't foolish, it was insurance. Meanwhile, beneath the glitter of chieftains and gods, practical revolutions were brewing. The shipbuilders were growing restless. They'd been crafting boats for fishing and trade for centuries, sturdy, yes, but limited. Then came the breakthrough overlapping planks, riveted with iron forming flexible hulls that bent with the sea instead of against it. These clinker-built vessels were lighter, faster, and could survive both open ocean and shallow rivers. Add a single square sail, and you had a machine that could cross worlds. In the fjordside workshops, every plank was shaped by eye, every nail hand-forged. You can almost hear the rhythm, hammer hiss hammer, the music of an age awakening. The keel was the spine, the ribs, the bones, the sail, the breath. It's no wonder the Vikings later buried their dead in ships. These vessels were extensions of their souls. Even in death, you were expected to keep sailing. By the late 700s, the North was ready. The Vendel lords had built the stage, trained the players, and rehearsed the rituals. All they needed was a cue the spark to ignite centuries of pent-up skill and ambition. That cue came in the form of hunger, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of boredom. The harvests were never enough. The younger sons of Jarls had no land to inherit. And beyond the horizon lay whispers of monasteries, rich, soft places where men prayed instead of fought, where gold sat unwatched on altars. The Vendel age didn't end so much as it evolved, slipping seamlessly into what we now call the Viking age. The ornate helmets were set aside for lighter gear. The decorative swords became tools of conquest, but the spirit remained the same, daring, disciplined, theatrical, and unsatisfied. Before the Vikings carved their stories into the world, they carved them into the air, into firelight, and the hush between waves. In the long winters, when wind screamed down from the mountains and snow sealed every door, stories were warmth. They were maps of meaning drawn across the darkness. To understand the Vikings, you have to understand the gods who lived in their heads. These weren't distant, perfect beings gazing down from golden clouds. They were complicated, moody, gloriously flawed, just like the people who told their stories. The Norse pantheon was less a tidy hierarchy and more a raucous family dinner with divine egos at both ends of the table. At the head sat Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, god of war and wisdom, poetry and death. If Zeus was a thunderous CEO, Odin was a philosopher king who slept under bridges and occasionally set them on fire. He didn't simply know things, he paid for knowledge. According to the old poems, he gave up one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom and later hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to win the secret of the runes. In modern terms, this was the guy who would willingly delete half his brain to upgrade the other half. To the Norse, Odin represented the ruthless intelligence of survival, the kind of cunning that gets you through winter when brute strength won't. Warriors prayed to him before battle poets invoked him before speaking, and kings claimed his favor to legitimize their rule. But Odin's blessing was risky. He was the sort of god who gave you victory only if he could collect your soul afterward. Then there was Thor, Odin's opposite in almost every way. While the All-Father brooded in the clouds of philosophy, Thor got things done. Red-bearded, loud, and direct, he was the working man's deity, the patron of farmers and sailors. His weapon? Mjolnir, the hammer that could flatten mountains and return like a loyal dog, was the divine equivalent of a multi-tool. You didn't need to be a scholar to pray to Thor. You just needed to want to live another day. His hammer blessings were used not only to sanctify battles, but to bless weddings, births, even bread dough. The hammer also became a quiet symbol of defiance. When Christianity began to creep north, centuries later, converts wore crosses. Pagans answered with tiny silver hammers. It was theology by jewelry, charming portable rebellion. But the gods weren't all masculine thunder and strategy. There was Friar God, of fertility and peace, who made crops grow and people do the same. His sister Freya, goddess of love, magic, and war, was one of the most complex figures in the Norse cosmos. She taught Odin the art of cider, a form of ecstatic magic that blurred the line between prophecy and manipulation. She rode into battle on a chariot pulled by cats, because of course she did, and took half of the warriors slain, each day the other half going to Odin. Her hall Folkvanger was a rival to Valhalla, less mead and mayhem, more mystery and song. Beneath all of them coiled Loki the trickster. Half genius, half chaos gremlin Loki was that friend who ruins the party but also saves it. He was the problem, and the solution rolled into one shape-shifting package. Sometimes he helped the gods. Other times he nearly destroyed them. Without Loki, there would be no tension, no moral testing, no story worth telling. He was the mirror that reminded everyone, even gods, that cleverness without conscience leads straight to ruin. Together, these gods created a moral universe that felt startlingly human. The Norse didn't imagine paradise as eternal comfort. They imagined it as eternal struggle with purpose. The afterlife wasn't about peace, it was about belonging. If you died bravely, you went to Valhalla or Folkvanger to train for Ragnarok, the final battle, when even the gods would die. Cowards didn't burn forever. They simply faded into nothing, which to a Viking might have been worse. This cosmic fatalism wasn't despair. It was clarity. They knew everything ends, some are kings, even the sun. But if the ending was inevitable, what mattered was how you faced it. Honor wasn't a virtue, it was a strategy. In a world where tomorrow could freeze your crops or sink your boat, legacy was the only immortality available. Their religion wasn't confined to temples. It was woven into daily life. A fisherman might whisper to Njord, god of the sea, before pushing off. A mother might hang an amulet of Thor's hammer above her child's bed. Offerings of mead or blood were made at Blot's sacrificial feasts that blurred the line between worship and community barbecue. Meat was shared, ale flowed, and people toasted not just to gods, but to ancestors' heroes and the occasional boastful neighbor. The gods were part of the family, flawed, demanding, and loved despite it. Their cosmology was a map of relationships, not rules. The universe, they believed, was bound together by the roots and branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree. Its roots drank from wells of wisdom, its branches brushed the heavens, and its trunk linked all 9 realms, Asgard of the gods, Midgard of men, and worlds stranger still. At the base, a dragon named Nidugr gnawed endlessly at the roots, while an eagle perched high above trading insults with the serpent through a gossipy squirrel messenger named Ratatoskr. The entire cosmos, in other words, operated on divine pettiness. But within that chaos was a kind of beauty. Life was fragile, temporary, and magnificent, like a spark caught in the snow. The Norse gods didn't promise salvation. They promised solidarity. Even the gods themselves would die at Ragnarok, fighting beside humankind. In a universe run by fate, courage was the only rebellion. This theology shaped everything the Vikings became. It taught them to respect risk, to laugh at doom, and to find meaning in motion. You can see it in their art, interlaced beasts, devouring themselves, serpents, swallowing their tails, swords engraved with runes that mean both protection and peril. You can hear it in their sagas, heroes who lose everything, yet are still called great. When a Norseman stood on the prow of his ship, salt on his face, and storm on the horizon, he wasn't expecting divine rescue. He was joining a conversation older than words, between man and sea courage and chaos gods and their restless children. That conversation, the faith that taught men to sail into uncertainty, would soon become literal. Because the next time the gods whispered in a northerner's ear, it would not be about fate or poetry. It would be about wind waves and the promise of everything beyond. The Vikings did not invent the sea, but they came closest to understanding it. For most of human history, the ocean was an obstacle, something to survive, not something to master. Yet for the people of the North, it was a companion, a mirror, and sometimes a monster that could be coaxed into obedience. The land gave them stones and forests, but it was the sea that gave them freedom. And freedom, for a restless culture like theirs, was more intoxicating than gold. Before the Viking Age truly began, the people of Scandinavia were already shipwrights of astonishing skill. Their earliest vessels were humble things, hollowed logs, stitched planks, fishing boats hugging the shorelines. But through centuries of trial and saltwater failure, they learned something that would change world history. The ocean didn't need to be conquered. It needed to be negotiated with. The breakthrough came with what scholars later called the clinker-built hull. Instead of joining planks edge to edge, Scandinavian shipbuilders overlapped them, fastening each with iron rivets. It looked simple. It was revolutionary. The result was a hull that could flex with the waves instead of shattering against them, light enough to haul across land, strong enough to ride the North Sea. These ships were the difference between a coastal people and a global one. You can imagine the workshop, smoke rising from a beachside pit, the smell of tar and pine resin thick in the air. Men with weathered hands shave curves into oak, with tools inherited from their fathers, listening to the woods whisper. Every plank is chosen for its grain, its strength, its willingness to bend. A ship, one could say, is built like a family. Too rigid it breaks. Too loose it falls apart. They added a single square sail wool, woven by women whose work powered an empire. Those sails were dyed deep red or striped in bold patterns, turning the horizon into a pageant of color and menace. When the wind filled them, it was as if the ship itself had drawn breath. The first time one of these new longships slipped into the sea, the world grew smaller. It could carry dozens of men, supplies, animals, even livestock. It could glide up shallow rivers, beach itself without a harbor, and then set sail again by the next tide. Its low draft and symmetrical bow meant it could reverse direction instantly, a feature every raider would soon appreciate. The longship wasn't just transportation. It was an idea, fast, flexible, fearless. And the idea spread like fire through dry heather. Each coastal community built its own fleet, each chieftain a bigger and bolder vessel to prove his worth. Soon, the sea lanes between Norway, Denmark, and Sweden became highways of ambition. Ships carried not only warriors, but traders, poets, craftsmen, and wanderers who measured distance not in miles, but in stories. The longship was both stage and weapon. When it approached, the sight alone could undo a village. Its dragon-headed prow, carved in fierce spirals, gleamed with wet paint and superstition. Dragons were not random decoration. They were living charms, spiritual armor to frighten spirits and enemies alike. The longship was alive. It hissed as the planks flexed. It breathed as the sails filled it, roared when the men rowed in rhythm. Even their word for war, Vikinger, comes from movement to go adventuring by sea. Inside these vessels, the line between sailor and warrior blurred. Each man knew the ropes, the oars, and the sword. They slept beneath the same timbers that carried them into battle. Beneath the deck lay shields painted bright yellow, red, or black, not just for protection, but for spectacle. A fleet of 20 ships gliding toward your harbor would look less like an army and more like a mobile sunrise, beautiful and horrifying at once. The sea itself became their school. Children learned early how to balance on a rocking plank, how to read the moods of clouds, how to judge distance by the taste of wind. Navigation was half instinct, half science. There were no compasses, no charts. Instead, the Vikings used sunstones to track sunlight through clouds, seabirds to predict land, and the rhythm of waves to sense unseen shores. They could read the world like a manuscript written in foam. Even the gods of the north seemed to admire such craftsmanship. Njord, Lord of the Sea, was said to bless those who built ships true to form. Thor's hammer was invoked to consecrate each keel before launch its head dipped in seawater like baptism. And when a great ship took to the waves, for the first time, the entire village gathered to watch, cheering as it slid free from the shore as though another soul had just been born. Owning a ship meant more than status. It meant agency. A chieftain with ships could raid trade or migrate at will. He could command loyalty not just through blood, but through opportunity. Those who joined his crew weren't mere followers. They were investors in a dangerous dream. They might return home rich in silver, or not at all. And this was where something subtle shifted in the Norse mind. A man who could cross an ocean no longer saw himself as trapped by his homeland. He belonged to a wider world. The horizon stopped being a limit and became an invitation. Still, building ships of that quality wasn't easy. It required entire communities, the shipwrights, the smiths who forged the rivets, the women who wove the sails, the farmers who felled oak trees and donated pitch and wool. In a sense, every longship was a village in disguise, a floating piece of social engineering held together by faith and ambition. When the prow cut through fog, it carried not just warriors, but the prayers of those who built it. Over time, shipbuilding itself became a sacred art. Masters guarded their techniques like priests guarding relics. They knew how to curve the keel so the vessel would dance on waves, how to space the ribs so that wind and water would balance instead of fight. Each successful voyage was proof that human hands could rival the gods in creation. By the late 8th century, the harbors of Norway and Denmark were filled with sleek shapes resting on the sand like sleeping predators waiting for the tide. Some were trading ships, heavy-bellied for cargo. Others were skied, the warships long, narrow, built for speed and terror. The best of them could cut through 10 knots of water, outrunning anything afloat. And so, when the first sails appeared off the coast of England in 793 AD, those dragon-proud ghosts gliding toward Lindisfarne, the world had no idea it was watching a masterpiece at work. The monks saw only heathen men from the sea. They didn't know that every swing of an axe, every chant of a rower, every gust filling those crimson sails was the culmination of centuries of experiment and artistry. In that moment, the longship was more than wood and cloth. It was civilization in motion, a mobile homeland, a floating declaration that the North would no longer be silent or distant. Wherever its prow pointed, history followed. The North, for all its wild independence, was not anarchy. It was balance, an unsteady negotiated balance that worked only so long as everyone knew where they stood. At the top of that order stood the jarls, the noble class. Their longhouses crowned the ridges above fjords, smoke curling from the roof vents like quiet signatures of power. They were the chieftains, war leaders, and hosts of the legendary feasts that stitched loyalty into flesh and bone. To dine in a jarl's hall was to step into a living theater benches, heavy with roasted mead flowing like melted amber walls, glittering with shields and polished bronze. Musicians sang of ancestors, poets skalds recited verses about the host's courage, and warriors pounded their cups in rhythm, echoing the sea's heartbeat. A jarl ruled not because he owned land, though he did, but because he could command respect. His wealth was measured less in silver than in generosity. To hoard was to invite scorn. To give was to grow. A great leader's reputation lived and died at his feast table. If you couldn't feed your followers through winter or reward them after battle, they would sail under another man's banner by spring. Below the jarls stood the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen, the backbone of Norse society. They owned their land, their tools, and most importantly, their time. A carl could speak in the thing the assembly, where disputes were settled and laws recited from memory. He could bear arms trade goods and even join an expedition if fortune or hunger called him to sea. These were the men who built the ships, tamed the fields, and fought the wars, and they did it without bowing to any lord's permanent authority. A carl's farm was a kingdom in miniature. Picture it a cluster of timber buildings, surrounded by fences and grazing animals perched at the edge of forest or fjord. Inside, the hearth glowed through winter, tended by women whose labor kept the world turning. They wove the wool for sails, brewed the ale, managed the food stores, raised children, and often ran the household while the men were away. In many sagas, the sharpest minds are not warriors, but wives, women who outthink rivals, manage estates, and sometimes, if wronged, arrange remarkably poetic revenge. A woman in Viking society could own property, demand divorce, and reclaim her dowry. She could inherit land sue in court, and if widowed, rule her household outright. In an age when much of Europe treated women as extensions of their husband's shadow, the North allowed them to cast shadows of their own. Archaeologists have even found high-status female graves filled with keys, the symbol of household authority, and in some weapons and staffs suggesting they held priestly or political power. Beneath this world of freemen and nobles, however, toiled another class, the thralls. Slaves, captives, debtors, and the unlucky, they were the invisible machinery of prosperity. A thrall might work the fields, forge iron haul timber, or row in a jarl's ship. They could be bought, sold, or inherited. Yet even slavery here carried shades of pragmatism. Some thralls could earn freedom. Some even married into free families after years of service. It was a brutal system, yes, but less about bloodlines than circumstance. In the sagas, you find freedmen who become respected traders and nobles who fall into servitude after losing everything. The North had no illusions of permanence. Fortune could be as slippery as ice. And it wasn't just human labor that greased the wheels of Viking life. It was social contract. The entire order depended on a web of reciprocity. The jarl gave protection, the carl gave service, the thrall gave labor. But each expected something in return: loyalty, fairness, sustenance. When that balance broke, when a chieftain became too cruel, or a farmer too proud, the result wasn't rebellion so much as quiet departure. In a land with endless coastlines, the surest way to protest was to leave. Justice, too, worked through consensus. The thing, part parliament, part court, part festival, was where law was spoken not written. Picture hundreds of free men standing in a meadow, their cloaks snapping in the wind, while a law speaker recited entire codes from memory. The law wasn't a tool of kings, it was the voice of the community. Every farmer there had the right to speak his case. Every dispute had to be settled through witness and compensation rather than vengeance, at least in theory. In practice, well, axes occasionally spoke louder than words. Honor was the currency that bound it all. A man's worth was not his wealth or title, but his reputation, his drengskaper. Lose that and you lost everything. If insulted, you demanded restitution. If wronged, you sought weregild, a man price, a set payment for injury or death. Murder wasn't simply punished. It was balanced, measured, accounted for. Too much blood spilled without payment invited feud, and feuds could last generations. The sagas are full of them, long, tragic spirals where pride outweighs peace until the last survivor stands alone, rich in honor and poor in company. Despite this grim economy of pride, the Viking world was not joyless. These were people who celebrated everything: births, deaths, harvests, even the first catch of spring. They loved riddles, jokes, and storytelling, especially the kind that poked fun at kings. They admired bravery, yes, but also wit. The trickster Loki was proof that cleverness was divine, and poetry skaldskaper was a weapon as powerful as any blade. If there was one secret to the Viking social order, it was mobility. Though the jarls sat at the top, the ladder wasn't nailed down. A bold carl could gain fame, wealth, and followers through a single expedition, becoming a leader in his own right. Many of the great saga heroes began as nobodies, farmers, wanderers, or outlaws who made fortune and fame through sheer nerve. The Viking world rewarded risk. It was a meritocracy. If your idea of merit included surviving battle, braving oceans, and making sure people remembered your name long after your bones turned to dust. By the 8th century, this three-tiered world, Jarls, Karls, Thralls, was stable yet brimming with restlessness. Young men who owned no land looked to the sea as the only inheritance left. The farmers, too, knew that trade could bring silver faster than harvests ever could. And the Jarls, they saw opportunity written across the horizon, an empire waiting to be plundered or partnered with. The hall fires still crackled, the things still met, and the gods still received their offerings. But under the sound of hammers and feasting songs was another rhythm, faint, impatient like oars slapping water. The ships were ready. The crews were restless. And one summer morning, as gulls wheeled above a gray northern sea, sails began to rise like wings. The old world of balance and law was about to learn what happened when the restless children of Odin decided the horizon wasn't far enough. The morning was calm. Too calm, really. Off the northeast coast of England, the little tidal island of Lindisfarne lay draped in sea mist, as though God himself had pulled a thin veil over it for protection. The monks were already awake, chanting, tending their gardens, and illuminating manuscripts whose colors still shimmer today in museum glass. They had been here for over a century, far from worldly noise, surrounded only by salt wind and the cry of gulls. The island was holy, tranquil, unreachable. Or so they thought. Out beyond the fog, something moved. Long, dark shapes low on the water, sails swelling like lungs. To the monks, they looked almost spectral ships, without reason or warning. But they were not ghosts. They were the first messengers of a new world. The date was June 8, 793 AD. By sunset, Christendom would have a new word for terror: Viking. When the ships beached, they did it like predators, fast, clean, without hesitation. No waiting for harbors, no negotiations. The men leapt out barefoot into the shallows, shields on arms, axes flashing with reflected sky. They were lean from weeks at sea, wrapped in furs and iron. Their hair bound their faces untroubled by hesitation. To the monks, it must have felt like the sea itself had turned against them. These were not amateurs. Their landing was a masterpiece of coordination. In minutes, the monastery's narrow defenses were overrun. The raiders moved as one organism, some securing the boats, others cutting paths to the storerooms and the church. The old chroniclers wrote that they destroyed God's house with rapine and slaughter, but to the Vikings, it was business, not blasphemy. They were after portable wealth chalices, silver plates, jeweled reliquaries, and more valuable still people. Captives could be sold back home, or in the bustling slave markets of Dublin and Hedeby. It's easy centuries later to imagine chaos, but the accounts suggest something colder efficiency. The raiders had studied the coastline. They knew the tides, the causeway that stranded the island at high water, and the fact that the Northumbrian mainland was unprepared for a seaborne enemy. This was not random cruelty. It was reconnaissance turned opportunity. When word reached the mainland, the reaction bordered on hysteria. Alcuin of York, the learned scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote in horror that never before has such terror appeared in Britain. To him, these northern pagans were not mere men, but omens, proof that divine wrath had broken through the seawall of Christendom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it with grim understatement. Heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. The simplicity makes it worse. The shock is still audible in the silence between the words. In truth, the attack was neither the first nor the last of its kind, but it was the one the world remembered. It struck not a fortress, but faith itself. Monasteries were symbols of God's peace, and the idea that warriors from the sea could stroll and slaughter monks and sail away unpunished shattered Europe's spiritual geography. For the Vikings, the raid was proof of concept. They had tested their new technology, the longship, against distance weather and defense. The experiment had worked perfectly. They were still alive richer, and legends were already forming around their names. Word would spread faster than any fleet. There is wealth in the West, and no walls high enough to keep it safe. What happened next was not an accident of barbarism, but a cascade of incentives. The Scandinavian homelands were tough places to grow old. Farms were small families large, and inheritance laws brutal. A younger son could expect little beyond a sword and a lecture about destiny. Across the sea lay monasteries filled with treasure towns, unfortified, and trade routes ripe for control. Raiding wasn't rebellion, it was economics. Over the next decades, the pattern repeated. Rathlin Island in 795, Iona in 802, and again in 806, where 68 monks were killed. Skye Dublin, the Orkneys. Each attack was another line drawn on Europe's collective nightmare. The rhythm was always the same: ships sliding out of the fog, the hiss of sand under keels, the roar of men who knew the element of surprise was their deadliest weapon. Yet even here, there was a strange logic, even artistry. Viking raids followed seasonal rhythms like migration. They set sail in spring, when the seas calmed, struck coastal settlements through summer, and returned home before winter's teeth closed in. Their navigation was almost supernatural to observers who could barely read the tides. They used landmarks, bird paths, and the color of the water itself, dark green for deep seas, pale gray for shallows. Some historians believe they even used sunstone's crystals that refracted sunlight through clouds, letting them find direction when others saw only storm. Their weapons, too, were products of centuries of refinement. Pattern-welded swords with rippling steel spears, balanced for both throwing and thrusting shields, painted in bright colors, so that battles looked like storms of moving suns. The famed round shield wall was their orchestra of survival warriors overlapping boards to form a single living wall of oak and iron. When it advanced, it groaned like thunder. Even the idea of terror was a deliberate tactic. Viking crews cultivated reputation as a weapon. Their dragon-proud ships, their ritual shouts, even their odd calm amid slaughter, all were psychological warfare. They wanted word of their arrival to precede them to loosen knees before swords were drawn. Fear was faster than wind and cheaper than blood. Still, to the monks and farmers who met them, the Vikings seemed like beings from myth, half men, half demons. Europe's poets described their attacks as plagues, their sails as black wings. The irony is that the same sea that brought Christianity north centuries earlier now carried paganism back south, wielding an axe. Behind the horror, though, a transformation was beginning. The Vikings were learning how easy it was to take from the outside world. Soon, they would learn how profitable it was to stay. The raids would grow larger, the targets richer. Individual crews would swell into fleets, and those fleets into armies. Kings back home, men like Harold Fairhair and the future rulers of Denmark, would realize that power was not just measured in acres, but in oars, but all that was still to come. For now, in the smoky wreckage of Lindisfarne, monks stumbled through blood and seawater, clutching what relics they could save. Their world had changed, though they couldn't yet know how deeply. The tide went out, as it always did. The gulls returned to their perches, and on the horizon, the longships vanished into the mist, their sails dimming to gray. Somewhere aboard, a young warrior leaned on his oar, listening to the creak of the hull and the hiss of waves. In his lap, a golden chalice gleamed dully under the gray sky. He wasn't thinking of gods or guilt, only of how light gold felt compared to wood and how the sea still called ahead. The flames of Lindisfarne did not go out, they spread. In the years that followed, 793, the sea became a highway of fire. The monasteries that had once stood as beacons of faith across the British Isles, calm, scholarly sanctuaries, filled with singing and ink, became torches lighting the Vikings' rise. From the Orkneys to the Irish Sea, one coastal abbey after another learned what it meant to wake to the sound of oars. Imagine it dawn, mist rolling off gray waves, bells tolling for morning prayers. The monks gather their chants soft and steady. And then faintly, the sea begins to whisper differently, rhythmic, purposeful. Oars, dozens of them. Before the psalm can end, the horizon splits. Red sails carved dragon heads, and the glint of iron where no iron should be. The first to fall after Lindisfarne was the monastery at Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland in 795. A small community barely fortified, blessed with wealth, and cursed with peace. The raiders struck swiftly, looting relics, burning the scriptorium, and carrying off captives whose lives now had a price in silver. The Irish annals recorded it briefly, the burning of the Retru by the heathens. So succinct, you could almost miss the panic beneath it. From there, the pattern repeated, like thunder, rolling through the Atlantic archipelagos. Iona, the holy island founded by St. Columba, became a special obsession. The Vikings raided it again and again. 795, 802, 806, each visit crueler than the last. In that final assault, they slaughtered 68 monks, staining the white sand crimson. Survivors fled inland to Kells, carrying the saints' relics, and miraculously, a book, the Book of Kells, whose intricate artistry would outlast every sword that threatened it. The brutality of these raids stunned Christian Europe, but to the Vikings' monasteries were simply soft targets. They were wealthy, undefended, and predictable sitting ducks, whose bells told you exactly when everyone would be inside. The monks may have prayed for protection, but from a Norse perspective, they were advertising treasure. And treasure they had. The church had become one of the richest landowners in the Western world. Altars dripped with gold, and silver reliquaries sparkled with gemstones, and manuscripts were bound in plates of embossed metal. To the Vikings, who valued portable wealth over land, this was irresistible. One chest of relics could feed a crew for months. A chalice could be melted down into rings and armbands, symbols of honor, to distribute among warriors. But there was more than greed at work here. Every raid was also reconnaissance. With each attack, the Vikings learned new coastlines, discovered trading ports, and mapped river mouths that would soon become gateways into the continent. They began to see not just monasteries to pillage, but entire kingdoms to exploit. Their tactics were surgical. They arrived by surprise, using the element of mobility that no land-based army could match. Their shallow draft ships could sail straight up estuaries deep into river systems like the Thames, the Seine, and the Loire, routes the locals thought safe from sea raiders. When the Vikings appeared on those inland waters, it was as if the earth had learned to bleed from within. Once ashore, their discipline was astonishing. Contrary to the wild legends later painted by terrified monks, they weren't berserkers in blind frenzy, at least not yet. Early Viking raids were clean-timed and efficient. Crews divided roles. Some guarded ships, others looted, others rounded up captives. Every man knew his task, and every minute on land increased the risk of counterattack. They struck loaded and vanished with the tide. By the time local militias mustered, the sea was already empty. Still, the psychological damage they left behind was enormous. The Christian world, built on the illusion that faith provided safety, suddenly felt naked. Kings scrambled to fortify coasts. Monasteries built watchtowers, and prayers for deliverance began to sound more like pleas of surrender. The image of the Northman hair, like sunlight eyes, like steel heart, like ice, spread across Europe as a living nightmare. Yet the Vikings were not devils. They were pragmatists, shaped by a brutal homeland. In Scandinavia, winter could erase a year's work overnight. Starvation was a constant neighbor. Raiding wasn't mindless destruction. It was survival wrapped in opportunity. Why starve through another winter when you could sail a few days and return with enough silver to buy an entire harvest? And so, the raids multiplied. In 799, they struck the island monastery of Noirmoutier at the mouth of the Loire. In 806, they hit Inishmurray and Skellig Michael in Ireland, scaling cliffs that even angels might hesitate to climb. By 820, fleets were prowling the coasts of France and Frisia, attacking ports towns and even royal villas. The Viking problem, as future chroniclers would call it, had become a continental epidemic. Ironically, these early assaults created one of history's strangest collaborations: terror-bred commerce. Once the initial panic subsided, some kings realized it was easier to pay the Vikings not to attack than to fight them. Thus was born the Danegeld, a kind of medieval protection racket that poured rivers of silver into Scandinavian hands. A clever Viking might raid one year and collect tribute the next, transforming from criminal to contractor overnight. Meanwhile, back home, the social effects were profound. Returning raiders brought silver and stories of soft lands, rich churches, and strange customs. Their loot financed new farms, new ships, and new feasts. Young men hearing tales of adventure began to view the sea not as exile, but as opportunity. Entire generations were raised on the promise that beyond the waves lay fortune and fame. And while Europe wrote prayers against them, the Vikings wrote songs for themselves. Around firelight, skalds recited verses celebrating the brave who crossed the whale road to reap wealth and renown. The word Vikinger itself came to mean not just a person, but a lifestyle, a calling that combined warrior, trader, and explorer into one. Yet for all their cunning, the Vikings were not untouchable. every raid risked overreach. A storm could destroy a fleet. A single ambush could end a chieftain's reputation. And with success came greed, and with greed came ambition. No longer content with raiding, some began to think, what if we stayed? Why steal grain when we could own the fields? Why burn the monasteries when we could tax them? The shift was subtle but decisive. The age of lightning raids was about to give way to the age of armies, of kings and conquests of permanent settlements that would shape nations. The first sparks of empire were glinting off Viking axes, even as the last monastery fires cooled. But in the 9th century's dawn, none of that was certain yet. To the monks huddled behind scorched walls, the Northmen were not future kings or founders of cities. They were a storm that refused to end. By the middle of the 9th century, the rhythm of Viking raids had become so familiar that coastal dwellers could almost set their calendars by it. Spring brought the smell of salt and fear. Summer meant smoke on the horizon. Autumn was a season for counting the missing. But what came next was not just another raid. It was something bigger, something organized, something terrifyingly permanent. The year was 865 AD, and across the North Sea sails began to rise in numbers no one had ever seen. This was not a handful of longships chasing silver. It was an army. Thousands of warriors drawn from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, veterans of decades of raiding, now united under one ambition: conquest. Chroniclers would later call it the Great Heathen Army. The name alone carried the weight of apocalypse. To the Anglo-Saxons, the invaders seemed like a tide of darkness. To the Vikings, it was simply good business. Raiding had limits. You could only plunder so many monasteries before the treasure ran out. But land, that was wealth that fed itself. The Vikings had tasted the fertile soil of Britain, seen the weakness of its divided kingdoms, and decided to stop raiding and start ruling. England in the 9th century was not a single nation, but a mosaic of rival realms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, each with its own king ambitions and quarrels. To men raised on the clan feuds of Scandinavia, this looked less like unity and more like invitation. Divide and conquer was not strategy. It was instinct. The fleet that landed in East Anglia that autumn was vast, perhaps a few thousand men, aboard hundreds of ships, their sails blotting out the horizon. They came ashore near modern-day Suffolk and did something unexpected. They didn't immediately start killing. Instead, they negotiated. King Edmund of East Anglia, wisely or desperately, offered them horses and supplies in exchange for peace. The Vikings accepted. They had no need for blood. Just yet, they were preparing for something larger. The army overwintered in East Anglia, an innovation that stunned their enemies. Until then, Viking raids had followed the rhythm of the season's hit, in summer retreat before winter. But this army built camps, fortified their ships, and endured the cold. They weren't visitors anymore. They were residents. When spring came, they moved north, fast and ruthless. Northumbria, once proud and learned home of Lindisfarne, and scholars like Bede, was tearing itself apart in civil war. Two kings, Osbert and Ella, were fighting for the throne when the Vikings arrived, and civil war is exactly what the Vikings loved to see. They marched on York, the great northern city, and took it with stunning ease. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that sober record of English history, simply notes, "The heathen army captured York." It sounds almost polite, as if the chronicler couldn't bear to describe what followed. When the two rival kings united too late to take it back, they charged the Viking defenses and were slaughtered at the city walls. Legend says Ella, who had once executed Ragnar Lothbrok by casting him into a pit of snakes, was captured alive and killed by Ragnar's sons in the notorious Blood Eagle ritual. Historians debate if the Blood Eagle was real or propaganda, But what mattered was the message the sons of Ragnar had avenged their father. Whether Ragnar himself truly existed as a single man or as a tapestry of several legendary warriors doesn't really matter. To the Vikings, he was the symbol of everything they were cunning fearless, destined for both glory and doom. His supposed sons, Ivar, the boneless Halfdan, and Ubba, became the faces of the great heathen army. And if Ragnar was myth, his sons were reality with steel in hand. Ivar, the boneless, especially fascinated both his allies and his enemies. No one knew why he was called that. Perhaps a disease, perhaps a metaphor for his strange, quiet presence, but everyone agreed he was dangerous. While other warlords sought fame through blood, Ivar sought control. He preferred strategy to slaughter, persuasion to chaos. Even his enemies admitted he was brilliant. One chronicler described him as a man more cruel than all others, but cruelty in those years was just another word for efficiency. After crushing Northumbria, the Vikings turned south into Mercia and East Anglia. King Edmund tried to resist, but his army was no match for the hardened warriors who'd been fighting since childhood. The story goes that Edmund refused to renounce his faith, so the Vikings tied him to a tree, shot him full of arrows, and beheaded him. He was later canonized as Saint Edmund Martyr of the New Age. The monks who wrote his legend couldn't have known that his death marked not an ending, but a beginning, the birth of the Danelaw. The great heathen army didn't just pillage, it restructured. Wherever it went, it left behind garrisons, fortified camps, and settlements. They seized farmland, and towns installed puppet kings and collected tribute known as geld. They weren't destroyers anymore. They were administrators. Archaeology has confirmed what the old chronicles could only hint at. The Vikings brought with them entire infrastructures of occupation. Excavations of their camps show planned layouts, defensive ditches, and workshops for repairing weapons and forging tools. Their armies traveled with blacksmiths, cooks, traders, and even families. This was a mobile civilization, not a mob. Still, resistance grew. Mercia fell, but Wessex, southern England, ruled by the determined King Alfred, held the line. Alfred was everything the Vikings hated in an opponent: cautious, intelligent, and infuriatingly patient. He avoided open battle, built fortified towns, and waited for the right moment to strike. For now, though, the Vikings ruled most of the island. By the late 860s, the great heathen army had carved a new political reality out of chaos. The regions under Scandinavian control became collectively known as the Danelaw, a land where Norse law language and culture took root. Old English mingled with Old Norse. Place names like Darby Grimsby and Whitby still carry those echoes today. In the markets of York, now Jorvik, you could buy spices from the East Irish silver and slaves from every corner of the North Sea world. The city became a Viking capital, bustling and brutal, its streets filled with the smell of fish forge smoke and ambition. Merchants haggled in half a dozen tongues. Runes were scratched onto everything from sword blades to combs. The Norse gods had come to stay, and Odin's ravens perched on every banner. And yet, beneath their triumph, the Vikings had changed. Conquest required stability. Stability required compromise. The fierce raiders who once lived by the oar now found themselves collecting taxes, judging disputes, and defending borders. They had become what they once despised rulers, burdened by administration. The wolves had become shepherds. But for a time, brief, bright, and brutal, they ruled the heart of England. The great heathen army, born from vengeance and greed, had done something extraordinary. It had turned chaos into empire. But its success carried the seed of its undoing. The moment the raiders stopped moving, the world around them began to adapt. and somewhere in the marshlands of Wessex, a patient king was waiting for the tide to turn. The year was 878 AD, and England was dying one piece at a time. Smoke rose from what had once been kingdoms, now just names carved into ash. Northumbria had fallen. East Anglia was gone. Mercia had bent its knee. Only one realm remained, a stubborn pocket of resistance clinging to the south, surrounded by enemies and soaked in rain. Wessex. And its king Alfred was on the run. You might imagine kings as men who dine under golden ceilings and issue commands from marble halls. Alfred at this moment was hiding in a swamp. The once proud ruler of Wessex had been driven into the marshlands of Somerset by Viking armies under the warlord Guthrum, a commander as ruthless as he was practical. The Viking conquest seemed total. Alfred's men were scattered, his cities overrun his crown, little more than a damp memory. But this was the marsh that would change history. Somerset's wetlands were no place for royalty. It was a maze of reeds, bogs, and freezing mists, where every step could drown you, and every night was alive with insects. Yet the marsh gave Alfred what no fortress could time to think, to plan, to endure. And in endurance, he was unmatched. He was not a man of brute force, this Alfred. He was a scholar, a strategist, a philosopher forced into war. The youngest son of King Ethelwulf, he had never been meant for the throne. But fate, that old Norse favorite, had other plans. Alfred's mind was his sharpest weapon. While others saw defeat, he saw calculation. The Vikings had conquered kingdoms before. Now he would show them what it meant to fight a nation. Legend paints Alfred during these bleak months as a humble figure. One story claims he sought shelter in a peasant woman's hut, hiding his identity. When she asked him to watch her loaves baking, the king, lost in thought, let them burn. She scolded him for his carelessness, unaware she was rebuking England's last hope. It's probably apocryphal, but the story endures because it feels true to Alfred's nature, a man so buried in ideas he forgot the bread. Meanwhile, the Vikings were feasting in his halls. Guthrum, leading what was left of the great heathen army, believed Wessex finished. His men wintered comfortably in captured towns, drunk on victory and ale. But Alfred was not idle. Hidden in the wetlands, he gathered loyal Then's lords who had not bent the knee and rebuilt what war had scattered. Messengers slipped through enemy lines, like ghosts carrying word that the king still lived. And the people answered. Farmers, woodsmen, fishermen, ordinary men who had lost homes and families to the invaders came to the marsh to fight. They brought axes, bows, and the kind of fury that only desperation can forge. From the mud, an army was reborn. When spring came, Alfred struck. The chronicles say he emerged from the marshes like something resurrected, his banner bearing the white dragon of Wessex fluttering against the morning mist. He moved fast, striking Viking outposts, reclaiming lost ground, and rallying the countryside. Then in May of 878, he confronted Guthrum's army head-on near a place called Edington. The two forces met on a green ridge under a gray sky. The Vikings were confident they had never known defeat in England. Alfred's men, outnumbered and exhausted, formed a shield wall on the slope. The battle began as thunder, a storm of iron and breath. Shields crashed together, swords flashed like lightning, and the air filled with the deep rhythmic chanting of war. Those old Norse cries, answered now by English ones. The shield wall was the great equalizer of the age, a living barrier, men shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping like dragon scales. Push too hard, and it broke. Hold firm, and it could grind even giants to dust. Alfred knew this. He waited for the Viking line to overextend, for fatigue to seep in, for the arrogance of victory to crack. Then he pushed. The wall surged forward with the roar of a tide, axes rising and falling in brutal rhythm. When the Vikings began to waver, Alfred's men pressed harder step by step until Guthrum's force collapsed under its own confidence. The Vikings fled to their camp, pursued and surrounded. After 2 weeks, they surrendered. It was a stunning reversal. The world that had watched England crumble now watched a king crawl out of the mud to rebuild it. Guthrum defeated, but alive sued for peace. Alfred, wiser than most victors, did not demand vengeance. Instead, he demanded conversion. Guthrum agreed to be baptized, taking the Christian name Athelstan, with Alfred himself as godfather. It was not just a political act, it was theater mercy used as a weapon. The chroniclers described it as a triumph of faith. In truth, it was a triumph of psychology. Alfred knew that humiliation wrapped in grace lasted longer than bloodshed. The Treaty of Wedmore followed soon after, dividing the island into 2 spheres, Wessex and the Danelaw. The north and east would remain under Norse control, governed by Viking law and custom. The south and west would belong to the English. It was not peace in any romantic sense, but a ceasefire long enough for nations to breathe. Yet Alfred did not stop there. Once secure, he began to build fortresses, fleet schools. He reorganized the army into a rotating system, so no field was left untended, no village undefended. He founded burhs, fortified towns, spaced strategically across the kingdom, connected by roads ready to repel future invasions. He even began a navy seed, from which England's future sea power would grow. The man who once hid in a swamp was quietly reinventing the idea of kingship. He also reinvented something rarer identity. Before Alfred, there were many English peoples, Saxons, Angles, Jutes. After Alfred, there was the beginning of a single idea: the English. He translated Latin texts into Old English so his people could learn. He brought scholars from across Europe to teach at his court. He understood, long before anyone else, that the sword could defend a nation, but only knowledge could define it. As for the Vikings, they were not gone, only changed. Many settled in the Danelaw, farming the same soil they had once burned. They married locals, traded in markets, and raised children who spoke both tongues. The border between Norse and Saxon blurred until even names and laws began to merge. The age of raids was not over, but something had shifted. The invaders were becoming neighbors. The wolf was learning to live beside the shepherd. And at the heart of it all, Alfred, the man who once let bread burn in a peasant's oven, was quietly forging the foundation of a kingdom that would outlast both Dane and Saxon alike. He would die known as Alfred the Great, the first English king to earn that title. But his greatness didn't come from conquest. It came from the patience of a man who waited in the marshes, believing that even in defeat, a nation could be rebuilt. One thought, one brick, one heartbeat at a time. When the smoke cleared over England and Alfred's dragon banner finally rested, the sea began whispering north again. Across the waters in Norway and Denmark, a new generation of rulers was rising, men who no longer wanted to raid England, but to rule like it. The Viking Age was growing up. The wolves had tasted crowns, and now they wanted to wear them. In the Scandinavian homelands, power was shifting. For centuries, the North had been a patchwork of small chiefdoms, each fjord with its own ruler, each valley with its own laws. Loyalty was personal, not political. Allegiance was measured in feasts, not flags. But the age of lone jarls was ending. A few ambitious men began to dream of something larger, a united realm, a kingdom carved not from raids, but from alliances, blood oaths, and sometimes just blood. One of those men was Harold Fairhair of Norway, a figure who strode halfway between history and legend. According to the sagas, he was a young prince who fell in love, or at least in pride, with a woman named Gyda. She refused to marry him until he ruled all of Norway. which was an admirably ambitious form of flirting. Harold took her words literally. He swore not to cut or comb his hair until he had conquered every rival. Thus began the campaign that would change Norway forever. For over a decade, Harold fought his way up and down the coast, defeating rival chieftains and absorbing their lands. Each victory drew more men to his banner. Each defeat taught him how to win the next battle better. By the time his hair was finally uncut long and golden enough to earn the name Fair Hair, he had unified most of western Norway. It wasn't a tidy modern nation, but it was close enough to make the sagas swoon. Harold's unification wasn't all romance and glory. For every jarl he defeated, there were 10 who refused to submit. Many fled westward across the sea to the Shetlands, the Hebrides, Iceland, and beyond, carrying their grudges, their gods, and their shipbuilding skills with them. Thus, ironically, the creation of Norway scattered Norwegians across the North Atlantic. The same drive that made Harold a king made others exiles, and those exiles would soon become explorers. Meanwhile, in Denmark, another family of rulers was learning how to turn Viking ferocity into royal stability. The Danish kings were less mythic than Harold, but far more strategic. The first known among them, Gorm, the old ruled from Jelling, a small settlement that would become Denmark's spiritual heart. Gorm was a classic Viking patriarch, stern-strong and pragmatic. He married Thyra, a woman whose wisdom the sagas praised even above his own. Together, they built the first Danish dynasty, strong enough to look both inward and outward. Their son Harold Bluetooth inherited not only their throne, but their vision. He was named, apparently, for a discolored tooth branding it seems has always been important to leaders. Harold Bluetooth was the first Danish king to truly think in two languages, pagan and Christian axe and cross. He completed the fortifications at Jelling, raised a great mound over his parents' graves, and carved the famous Jelling stones, whose runic inscriptions declared King Harold made Denmark and Norway Christian. The truth was more complicated, of course. Harold didn't convert purely out of divine revelation. He did it because Christianity came with political benefits, alliances, legitimacy, and trade with the rest of Europe. A baptized king could negotiate with emperors. A pagan chieftain could not. The cross was the most efficient weapon of diplomacy ever forged. Denmark under Harold became a hub of power, its influence reaching south into the Holy Roman Empire, west across the sea to England, and north into Norway. He built circular fortresses, raised fleets, minted coins, and established royal roads. For the first time, Scandinavia was more than a scattering of raiders. It was becoming a network of states. Still, for all their ambition, these new kings were not tame. The sea was in their blood, and their thrones were anchored to it. They ruled from the water as much as from land, their kingdoms tied together not by roads, but by currents. To modern eyes, it seems strange to speak of the North Sea Empire, but to the Vikings, it was perfectly logical. The sea was not a border, it was the royal highway. Whoever ruled its waves ruled everything that touched them. And that dream, the unification of the sea itself, would soon fall to one of Harold Bluetooth's descendants, Knut the Great. But we'll come to him later. For now, the stage was being set. In Sweden, meanwhile, things were different. The Swedes looked less westward and more eastward toward the Baltic and the great rivers that led deep into the Slavic lands and beyond. From their ports on Lake Mälaren, they sent out merchant warriors who would one day become the founders of the Rus Vikings, who traded and raided along the Volga and Dnieper, reaching as far as Constantinople. While Norwegians sailed to Iceland and Greenland, and Danes struck England, and France the Swedes turned their longships inland toward the heart of the world. But for those who stayed behind in Scandinavia, the transformation was profound. The same people who once celebrated the freedom of the open sea were now building laws, churches, and cities. Towns like Ribahedeby and Kaupang became centers of trade, humming with markets and blacksmiths, silversmiths, and scribes. Coins stamped with Arabic script circulated beside runes. The old and new worlds coexisted awkwardly but productively. And yet beneath this veneer of civilization, the old instincts never truly died. When the weather turned rough, or a neighboring king grew too proud, the oars would come out again. The line between commerce and conquest remained beautifully blurred. From England to the Baltic, from Norway's mountains to Denmark's plains, a new era of Viking kingship had begun. Less about pillage, more about permanence. The warlords had become monarchs, and the longships now carried ambassadors as often as raiders. But the spirit of motion of restlessness never left them. On any given morning, along the coasts of the North Sea, you could still hear the sound that had once terrified Europe, the creak of hulls against the tide, the murmur of oarsmen waiting for wind. The difference was that now the sails bore not just dragons, but crosses. When Harald Fairhair finally unified Norway, his hair might have been magnificent, but not everyone was applauding. For centuries, the Norwegians had lived by the freedom of the fjords, answering to no man, except perhaps the gods and the weather. Harald's new order demanded taxes, obedience, and an acceptance of his kingship that rubbed many the wrong way. Independence ran in their veins like salt water. And so, as the sagas tell, a great exodus began, not of armies, but of families. They packed up their homes, their herds, their gods, and their grudges, and turned their prows west toward a rumor, a land across the sea where the grass grew high, the fish were endless, and no king's tax collector had ever set foot. That rumor was Iceland, and its discovery, as with all good Viking stories, began accidentally. Sometime around 860 AD, a Norwegian named Nadod was blown off course while sailing to the Faroe Islands. He spotted a vast, cold coastline, and perhaps unimpressed by the snow, called it Snaland Snowland. He didn't stay, but word spread. A few years later, another sailor, Floki Vilgerdarson, decided to test the tale. He brought livestock, family, and optimism. Unfortunately, he forgot about Icelandic winters. When the first frost came, his animals died, his supplies dwindled, and despair set in. Climbing a nearby mountain, he saw a fjord choked with ice and gave the island its famous name, Island. Ironically, Iceland was far kinder than it first appeared. Its coasts offered rich fishing grounds, its interior plains supported hardy livestock, and its valleys promised land free from royal decree. For those weary of Harald's rule, or of any rule, it was paradise. By the late 9th century, ships were setting sail in earnest. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, records the names of the early pioneers: Ingólfur Arnarsson, Aud, the deep-minded Kettle Flatnose. Each came with kin thralls and livestock staking claims to valleys and fjords. They carried with them pieces of Norway, carved beams, farm tools, seeds, and small wooden idols of Thor or Freyr. When Ingólfur's ship finally landed in the southwest around 874, he threw his high seat pillars overboard and vowed to settle wherever they washed ashore. They drifted to a steaming bay ringed by dark hills. He named it Reykjavik, the Smoky Bay, for the columns of geothermal mist rising from the earth. That act, half ritual, half practicality, marked the birth of Iceland's first settlement and symbolically the birth of a new society. Life on Iceland was unlike anywhere else in the Viking world. There were no kings, no castles, no ancient tribes. The settlers built turf halls dug into the hillsides, insulated with earth and moss. smoke curled from their hearths into the gray sky, blending with volcanic steam. Their days were shaped by the landscape summer sunlight that never ended winters where the sun barely rose. To survive, they relied on tight-knit families, fishing, and sheer stubbornness. But with freedom came a problem: how to govern without a king. The Norse, suspicious of tyranny but addicted to order, improvised something remarkable: a commonwealth. Instead of royal decrees, they created the Althing, one of the world's first parliamentary assemblies. Every free landowner could attend. Every major decision, from laws to disputes, was settled in open debate. Once a year, chieftains and farmers gathered in a vast lava plain called Thingvellir, the assembly fields. There, beneath cliffs and waterfalls, they built temporary camps, exchanged goods, settled lawsuits, and naturally told stories. It was part courtroom, part festival, part national therapy session. The law speaker, a man chosen for his memory and eloquence, recited the laws aloud from memory, for there were no written codes yet. Justice was achieved through consensus compensation and the occasional duel when words failed. To modern eyes, it might look primitive. To history, it was revolutionary. A society without kings, built entirely on law and reputation, where one's worth was measured not by titles, but by honor. Iceland became a kind of social experiment. What happens when the most independent people in Europe decide to share a very large rock in the middle of the Atlantic? The answer, Art. Isolation can break a culture or refine it. Iceland's broke the sword, but sharpened the tongue. With little warfare and long winters, storytelling became a national sport. Around their hearths, families recited poems and tales of the old gods, blending memory and imagination into something greater. These oral traditions, preserved for centuries, would later become the sagas, the heartbeat of Norse heritage. The sagas were not fairy tales. They were biographies of real settlers, filled with feuds, love wit, and the kind of dry humor that only comes from people who've survived too many storms. He was a brave man, one might say, of a hero, but not very bright. Another entry might read, "She was the most beautiful woman in the district, and entirely aware of it." They were, in essence, the world's first historical novels, epic in scope, domestic in detail, written by a people who saw no contradiction between poetry and practicality. Meanwhile, religion flourished in its own way. Temples to Thor and Freyr rose beside hot springs. Sacrifices were modest meat animals, the occasional boast. The gods here were closer to neighbors than rulers. They were part of the landscape. But as ships continued to arrive from Norway, so did Christianity. Missionaries began to whisper of a single god of heaven and hell, ideas that seemed both foreign and oddly familiar to a people who already believed in fate. The stage was being set for a quiet revolution of faith that would come a century later. For now, though, Iceland stood as a strange miracle, a democracy of exiles thriving in defiance of every law of geography. Its people farmed, fished, argued, and wrote. They sent ships to Greenland and eventually to lands even further west. In the sagas, the island is often described as the last edge of the world. But for the Vikings, that was precisely the point. The farther from kings they went, the closer they felt to freedom. And in that freedom, something extraordinary took root. A civilization that prized words over weapons, law over power, and the enduring belief that even at the world's edge, humanity could build order from chaos. For centuries to come, when the rest of Europe descended into war, Iceland would remain a quiet lamp on the map, a land of poets, farmers, and storytellers who proved that not all Vikings sought glory through conquest. Some sought it through memory. By the time Iceland had found its rhythm, a society of poets, farmers, and law speakers perched on a volcanic island, the horizon began to beckon again. freedom, it turned out, was contagious. And for those whose pride or temper couldn't coexist even under Iceland's broad skies, there was always farther west. That impulse, the refusal to sit still, birthed one of the strangest and most heroic migrations in history, the settlement of Greenland, a place whose very name was an act of optimism, or perhaps marketing. The man behind it was Eric the Red, whose name was as honest as his temper, a towering figure with a mane of flame-colored hair, and a talent for both charisma and trouble. Eric had inherited from his Norwegian ancestors not only their seafaring genius, but their knack for feuding. In Iceland, he killed a neighbor during a dispute, as one does, apparently was declared an outlaw and banished for 3 years. Exile, however, was just another word for opportunity. Stories reached him of a land to the west, sighted but not settled, where the sea froze hard and the mountains glowed blue even in summer. So, in true Viking fashion, Eric packed up his household, his livestock, and anyone brave or foolish enough to follow him, and set sail into the unknown. The voyage was perilous. Weeks of open ocean storms that could swallow ships whole, fog thick enough to erase the horizon. But eventually, through ice and mist, he found it an enormous island, rimmed with glaciers and cut with deep green fjords. The summer grass shimmered along the coasts, and the air, though cold, was clean and wild. It was both cruel and beautiful, a kind of divine dare. He called it Greenland, perhaps in irony, perhaps in hope, perhaps simply as an advertisement to lure future settlers. People will go where the name is inviting, he reportedly said, proof that Viking marketing strategies were centuries ahead of their time. When his exile ended, Eric returned to Iceland with tales of a vast fertile land where anyone could claim property, free of kings or quarrels. He told of good pastures, rich hunting, and fjords wide enough to anchor entire fleets. The truth, of course, was a little frostier, but the promise worked. Within a few years, ships were heading westward again, this time not as explorers, but as emigrants. The Greenland settlements began around 985 AD, with 2 main colonies, the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq and the western settlement farther north near Nuuk. Between them lay hundreds of kilometers of tundra and ice. Altogether, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 people made the journey: farmers, craftsmen, families, slaves, priests, and a few ambitious merchants. Life there was a test of patience and ingenuity. The settlers built turf-walled homes that hugged the earth like sleeping animals. Their livestock, sheep-goats, and hardy Icelandic cattle grazed during the brief summers, then spent winters inside breathing warmth into the shared air. Every resource was precious. Wood, almost non-existent, had to be imported from drifting timber or trade. Iron was rare, so tools were repaired endlessly, their edges worn thinner than a fingernail. Yet against all odds, the colony thrived. The Gulf Stream brought just enough warmth to make agriculture possible along the fjords. Barley could grow in sheltered valleys, and the sea provided fish, seals, and whales. Every summer, ships arrived from Iceland carrying grain iron and gossip. In return, Greenland exported walrus, ivory, polar bear hides, and falcons so prized that even European kings competed for them. And still, beneath the routine of farming and trade, a spiritual tension simmered. The settlers had brought their pagan gods with them: Odin, Thor, Freyr. But Christianity was spreading fast through the Norse world. By the early 11th century, Eric's wife, Theodhildr, had converted, building a small church near their estate at Brattahlid, against her husband's wishes. Eric, ever the stubborn pagan, refused to enter it, preferring the old gods who had carried him across the sea. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who built a chapel on the edge of the world was married to the man who named the place a lie. Their son, however, would look even farther. Leif Erikson, raised among Greenland's icy fjords, inherited both his father's daring and his mother's faith. He would take a ship west and find something greater than anyone imagined lands beyond the maps, where trees grew thick and rivers ran sweet. But that's another story, one of curiosity rather than survival. Back in Greenland, Eric's dream endured for centuries. The settlers adapted to a world that offered little mercy. They carved farms into permafrost, bred resilient animals, and learned to read the moods of the sea as though it were an unpredictable god. They hunted walrus deep into the Arctic, their ships edging past glaciers that groaned like living beasts. Every voyage was a wager against the weather. And somehow, for almost 500 years, they lasted. They built churches, held assemblies, and even minted their own bishops. Archaeologists have uncovered delicate wooden crucifixes and runic graffiti etched into stone names, prayers jokes, proof that even here, humanity refused to be silenced. But survival came at a cost. Greenland's settlers lived at the mercy of climate. When the medieval warm period cooled into the Little Ice Age, growing seasons shortened, sea ice thickened, and trade ships from Europe stopped arriving. The colonies grew isolated, slowly starving in slow motion. By the 15th century, the last farms fell silent. The Inuit, who had arrived centuries earlier from the Canadian Arctic, survived. The Norse did not. When Danish sailors rediscovered the ruins in the 1700s, they found only crumbling churches and empty halls, ghosts of a community that had once believed the edge of the world could be home. Yet their story is not tragedy, so much as testament. The Norse of Greenland proved something few civilizations ever could, that courage, when joined to stubbornness, can build life in the least likely places. They were farmers in a land of ice dreamers in a world of storms. And though their colonies faded, their legacy did not. From their frozen outposts, they looked westward one last time, toward the unknown land Leif Erikson would call Vinland, where wild grapes grew and forests reached the sea. The edge of the world, it seemed, had one more secret left to reveal. In the long twilight of the northern sea, where icebergs gleam like ghosts and the horizon seems to slide forever, a young man stood at the prow of a ship, squinting westward. His name was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, grandson of Norway's exiles, and he was about to become the first European to set foot on the shores of North America. Of course, he didn't know that. To him, it was simply another voyage, part rumor, part accident, part destiny. The story began, as so many Viking tales do, with a mistake. Around the year 985, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland when storms blew him wildly off course. He never landed, but he glimpsed a coastline unlike any he'd seen before. Flat forested with rolling hills, an impossible paradise compared to Greenland's stark cliffs. He told the tale upon returning, but no one believed him. Or perhaps they did, and pretended not to, because what sane man would sail into the unknown again? On purpose, Leif Erikson apparently. Raised among Greenland's rugged settlers, Leif had inherited both his father's appetite for risk and his mother's quiet piety. By the turn of the millennium, he'd traveled to Norway, converted to Christianity under King Olaf Tryggvason, and returned home with a new faith and, more importantly, new ambition. When he heard Bjarni's story, he saw not a cautionary tale, but an invitation. The old Norse instinct for exploration stirred again. What if the lands to the west were real and fertile? Around 1000 Nas AD, Leif assembled a small crew, perhaps 35 men, and set sail from Brattahlid in a sturdy Nar, a broader cargo-ready cousin of the longship. The voyage was treacherous, weeks of fog, floating ice, and the constant groan of wind against the sail. But one by one, the landscapes Bjarni described came into view. First came a rocky barren shore they called Helluland Flatstone Land, likely modern-day Baffin Island. Nothing grows here but cold. One sailor is said to have grumbled, which is about as fair a Yelp review as any Arctic region could expect. They pressed on southward. Next came Markland Forest Land, probably Labrador, where spruce and pine covered the coast in dark green waves. To men from treeless Greenland, it was paradise. They chopped timber, loaded their ship, and continued sailing, drawn by the mild air and the promise of something more. Finally, after days of following migrating birds, they reached a place unlike any they'd known. The air was softer, the rivers wide, and wild grapes hung from the vines. They called it Vinland Wineland. Its exact location remains one of history's favorite mysteries somewhere along the coast of Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, but the sagas describe it as rich, warm, and welcoming. For the Norse, who had carved farms out of tundra and rock for generations, this was another world. The soil was dark and generous. Rivers teemed with salmon so large that men thought they had never seen the like. The winters were milder, and the forests so dense that one could build a hall in a week instead of a year. Leif and his crew built houses from timber, dried their fish, and explored. The sagas even say they split into teams, naming one leader Leif the Lucky, a nickname that after surviving the Atlantic felt deserved. The settlement they built, likely at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, as archaeological evidence now suggests, was modest, sod-walled halls, storage huts, and a blacksmith's forge. There, Norse hands hammered the first iron in the Americas, centuries before Columbus's caravels ever touched the Caribbean. For a brief moment, two worlds brushed fingers across the ocean divide. The sagas tell of encounters with the native peoples, the Skraelings, as the Norse called them, meaning small ones, or foreigners. The exact identity of these groups is debated, likely ancestors of the Beothuk, or Dorset cultures, but the interactions were tense from the start. The Vikings, unused to diplomacy, outside their own, traded at first red cloth for pelts, milk for meat, but fear and misunderstanding soon poisoned the peace. In one account, a bull startled the Skraelings, causing panic and violence. In another, a Norseman killed a native in a quarrel, triggering a retaliatory attack. Arrows flew, stones were thrown, and the Norse realized that for all its beauty, Vinland was not theirs to claim. They held on for a few seasons, perhaps even years before abandoning the attempt. Leif returned to Greenland with a ship full of timber grapes and stories that bordered on myth. Others tried to follow his brother Thorvald, was killed by Skraelings during a later expedition. His sister Freydis, fierce and ambitious, led her own voyage marked by greed, treachery, and murder, proof that even in paradise, the old Norse dramas followed. The dream of Vinland faded quietly. Without steady trade or reinforcements, the settlements couldn't last. The distance was too vast, the logistics too brittle, and the locals far too numerous. The Norse turned their attention back east to Greenland, to Iceland, to Europe, and America slipped back into legend. And yet what they achieved was extraordinary. The Norse had crossed the Atlantic half a millennium before Columbus, guided not by empire or religion, but curiosity. They found a new continent, not because they needed it, but because they couldn't help looking. Their maps were memory, their navigation, pure instinct. When Leif's ship finally returned home, Greenland's settlers must have looked westward with both pride and melancholy, wondering what might have been. Archaeologists at Lonso Meadows have uncovered nails, rivets, and a spindle whorl, a sign that women were there too. Charcoal stains mark the hearths where Norse families once sat, telling stories under a foreign sky. The wind that sweeps across the Newfoundland coast still sounds like a whisper of that moment when Europe reached out briefly toward another world. Vinland didn't last, but its idea did. It was the farthest edge of the Viking imagination, proof that even on the harshest frontiers, their courage was matched only by their restlessness. And though they left little behind, but fragments of wood and iron, they also left something larger. The reminder that exploration begins not with maps, but with discontent, an itch that no horizon can soothe. When Leif Erikson died, the sagas say he was mourned as both a hero and a curiosity, a man who had sailed beyond the known world and returned living proof that there was always another shore. And as the North Sea darkened again with sails and ambition, his journey became legend, one last golden thread, tying the wild Viking age to the endless fabric of discovery. While Norwegians and Icelanders pushed westward into cold seas and forgotten continents, their Swedish cousins turned their longships east into rivers that flowed not into the ocean, but deep into the heart of the continent. Where the Western Vikings found monasteries and resistance, the Eastern Vikings, known as the Varangians, found trade silver and a new civilization waiting to be born. To stand on the Baltic shore in the 9th century was to see the world divide westward, the stormy Atlantic, full of danger and legend. Eastward, a mirror of calmer waters, scattered with islands and river mouths that led into mystery. And for the Swedes of old Uppsala and Birka, the East was irresistible. They called it the Way of the Rivers, a network of trade routes stretching from the Gulf of Finland through lakes and waterways that would one day become Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Those rivers were like veins running through a body of endless forest, carrying fur, amber honey, and slaves from the north, and bringing back silk wine and silver from the south. For a people raised on the rhythm of oars, these waterways were destiny. The first Varangians left Sweden in small bands, traders, mercenaries, explorers. They slipped past the Estonian coast into the wide Neva River, then down through Lake Ladoga to the Folkhof, where they built their first stronghold, Aldingjuborg, known today as Staraya Ladoga. From there, they continued to the great inland lake of Ilmen and founded a second settlement, Holmgard, which would become Novgorod. Here the Norse encountered the Slavs, Finno-Ugric tribes, and the Khazars of the steppe, a mosaic of cultures speaking in tongues that sounded like wind through reeds. The Varangians traded married and sometimes ruled by force. Their ships carried northern furs, walrus ivory, and slaves captured in raids exchanged for silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate stamped with Arabic script, a currency so prized that millions of such coins have been found buried across Sweden. To the Arabs, these strange seafaring traders were known as Rus, perhaps from the Old Norse roder, meaning the men who row. That word would echo through the centuries, eventually giving its name to an entire land, Russia. The sagas and chronicles are hazy on the details, but around the year 860, the Varangians had established a presence strong enough to demand tribute from local tribes. A century later, a legend took root that the Slavs, weary of infighting, invited a Varangian leader named Rurik to rule over them. "Our land is great and rich," they said, "but there is no order in it. Come and reign as prince over us." Rurik accepted and founded a dynasty that would rule for centuries. Whether the story is truth or myth, the result is the same. Scandinavian adventurers became the architects of the first Russian state, Kievan Rus. Rurik's successors, notably Oleg and Igor, expanded southward, following the Dnieper River, all the way to the Black Sea, where they came face to face with the splendor of Byzantium, the greatest city the Norse had ever seen. Imagine what that must have looked like to them. The golden domes of Constantinople gleaming in the sun, marble palaces, and markets overflowing with spices and silk. To men who came from a world of wooden halls and fjord mist, This was not just a city, it was another universe. The Byzantine chroniclers, of course, saw it differently. To them, the Rus were terrifying giant fair-haired men in mail shirts wielding axes that could cut through armor and arrogance alike. They attacked the city in fleets of longships, their sails blackened with pitch, their voices echoing hymns to Odin that must have sounded like thunder to the priests of Christ. In 860, they raided Constantinople itself, setting fire to its suburbs before being driven off by storms and, according to the Byzantines, divine intervention. But raids soon turned to treaties. By the 10th century, the Rus had become essential to the empire's trade. In exchange for peace and commerce, they offered soldiers. The Byzantine emperors quickly realized that these northern warriors made the best bodyguards money could buy, fiercely loyal, once sworn, and utterly unafraid of death. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of Norsemen who stood watch over the emperor himself. Their loyalty was legendary. They swore oaths directly to the throne, not to the shifting factions of court. They guarded palaces, fought in distant wars, and became the stuff of legend in both north and south. The sagas say that many a young Viking weary of frost and feud dreamed of serving in Constantinople's gilded halls, where gold was plentiful, the wine endless, and the enemies exotic. The road from the Baltic to Byzantium became one of the great arteries of the medieval world. Along it, the Norse carried not just goods, but ideas. They brought Christianity back north, along with Greek art, Slavic words, and a taste for empire. The Rus themselves, originally foreign overlords, blended with the Slavs they ruled. Their kings married local women, adopted Eastern rites, and began to write their names not in runes, but in Cyrillic. Within a few generations, the Viking origin of the Rus was half legend, half memory. Yet in their artifacts, the fusion remains visible. Archaeologists have found Norse weapons buried beside Byzantine coins, Scandinavian brooches beside Orthodox crosses. The graves at Gnezdovo and Ladoga tell a story of cultural chemistry, Vikings turning into princes, traders, turning into founders of nations. To the west, Europe still saw the Norse as raiders. To the east, they had become rulers. And somewhere between those two reputations lay the truth. They were connectors, linking seas, languages, and faiths into a single living network. By the end of the 10th century, the great age of river expansion was peaking. The Rus' capital moved to Kiev, trade flourished, and the princes of the north began to think less like adventurers and more like monarchs. When Prince Vladimir of Kiev converted to Christianity in 988, accepting baptism in Byzantine style, the last thread of pagan Scandinavia began to fray. But for the Vikings themselves, the Swedes who had followed the rivers south the eastern routes would always hold a strange allure. They had reached the edge of another world, where the air smelled of incense instead of salt, and the stories were written in Greek instead of runes. Back home in the fjords and forests, mothers would tell their children of brothers and sons who had gone east to fight for emperors, to build kingdoms, or to disappear entirely into the glittering maze of the east. Some would return rich, some never. But all who came back brought tales of a world beyond imagination, cities of marble deserts, of fire and oceans so wide they made even the Baltic seem small. For a people born between frost and sea, it was proof of something they'd always suspected: the world was larger than any god-king or coastline could contain. And if there was still more of it to find, the Vikings were already looking for the next river. By the dawn of the 10th century, the Viking world had stretched itself like a net across Europe. In the west, Norse settlers were farming the green valleys of Ireland and the Danelaw. In the north, Icelandic poets were building a republic out of verse and law. But to the east, to the deep, slow rivers and endless forests of the Slavic lands, a new kingdom had emerged from the wake of their longships. That kingdom was Kievan Rus. If you could have stood on the banks of the Dnieper River in those days, you'd have seen something extraordinary. A Viking city rising out of the wilderness, crowned with onion-shaped domes and ringed by wooden ramparts. Smoke from thousands of hearths drifted above markets, where merchants from 4 worlds met the Norse, the Slavs, the Greeks, and the Arabs. The road to Constantinople, the queen of cities, began here. Kiev, founded, expanded, and ruled by the descendants of Rurik, was both fortress and marketplace. It lay at the perfect crossroads, north to the Baltic, south to the Black Sea, east to the steppe, and west to Europe. Through its streets flowed furs, slaves, honey wax, amber silver, and rumor. You could buy a sword from a Swede, a prayer scroll from a Greek, a jewel from a Persian, and an arrow wound from a local you shouldn't have argued with. By the early 900s, the Varangian rulers of Kiev, first Oleg, then Igor, then Olga, and Sviatoslav, had forged something bigger than a trading outpost. They had built an empire. The sagas say that Oleg of Novgorod, a successor to Rurik, conquered Kiev around 882 and declared it the mother of Rus's cities, the primary chronicle. A medieval account, written centuries later, gives him an epithet, both poetic and ominous, Oleg the prophet. His prophecy was simple: let it be the capital of my realm. Oleg understood that power flowed not just from swords, but from silver. He controlled the river routes, levied tolls, and organized the Rus into something resembling a nation. In 907, he led a fleet of perhaps 2,000 ships down the Dnieper toward Constantinople, the richest city on earth. The Byzantines, accustomed to barbarians, but not to this many of them, panicked. Oleg, in classic Viking fashion, turned intimidation into theater. The legend says he ordered his ships to be fitted with wheels, so when the wind died, his men dragged them overland, rolling right up to Constantinople's walls. Whether that actually happened hardly matters. The symbolism was perfect. The message was clear. There was nowhere the Rus could not reach. The Byzantines negotiated rather than fought. They signed treaties of trade and tribute, filling the Norse coffers with silk, gold, and wine. Oleg returned to Kiev, triumphant, hanging his shield on the city gates of Constantinople, a gesture equal parts diplomacy and mockery. After Oleg's death, his kinsman Igor took the throne, continuing the pattern of raids and treaties. His wife, Olga of Kiev, became one of the most remarkable figures in early Russian history. When Igor was killed by rebellious tribesmen, she avenged him with a flair that made even saga heroes look polite. According to chroniclers, she invited the rebels to a peace feast, burned them alive in their bathhouse, and later tricked another village into destruction using flaming birds. Vengeance, it seems, could be both horrifying and inventive. Yet beneath the blood and legend, Olga also marked a turning point. She became the first Rus ruler to convert to Christianity after a diplomatic visit to Constantinople. Her baptism in the Hagia Sophia was both personal and political. She saw the writing on the wall: the Norse gods were fading, and in the empire's shadow, new faith meant new legitimacy. Her son, Sviatoslav, did not share her zeal for peace or piety. A warrior through and through, he lived for campaign and conquest. His armies marched as far as the Balkans, clashing with Bulgars, Khazars, and Byzantines alike. He was said to shave his head, except for a single lock of hair, wear golden earrings, and dine among his soldiers rather than on a throne. "I attack you," he once declared to an enemy, "for I desire glory." His life was short but incandescent, the perfect Viking soul in a Slavic crown. By the time his son, Vladimir the Great, took power around 980, Kievan Rus was a patchwork of tribes, faiths, and trade routes, rich but restless. Vladimir had a problem common to empire builders: too many gods, not enough unity. The Norse still worshipped Odin and Thor. The Slavs had their own pantheon of thunder and harvest spirits. Traders brought tales of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So, in one of the most consequential acts in European history, Vladimir decided to choose. The chronicles say he sent envoys to study the religions of the world. The Muslims' fasting was deemed too harsh. The Jews were homeless and thus unlucky. The Latin Christians lacked splendor. But when his men visited Constantinople and witnessed the golden mosaics and incense of the Hagia Sophia, they were stunned. We did not know, they reported, whether we were in heaven or on earth. In 988, Vladimir converted to Orthodox Christianity, married a Byzantine princess, and ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River. The image is staggering: thousands of men, women, and children standing waist-deep in the water as priests recited prayers in Greek and Slavonic, washing away centuries of paganism in one act of imperial theater. It was not faith alone that guided him, it was strategy. Conversion tied Kievan Rus to Byzantium through religion, diplomacy, and trade. The princes of Kiev gained legitimacy as God's chosen, and the once pagan Varangians became part of Christendom. Yet Christianity in Rus never fully erased its Viking roots. The new faith arrived draped in old habits. The churches were built where temples once stood. Saints took on the traits of old gods, and runic amulets coexisted with crucifixes. 1,000 years later, archaeologists would still find Christian burials with Thor's hammers hidden under the soil just in case. Meanwhile, the Norse presence in the region began to fade, not in defeat, but in absorption. The Rus princes spoke Slavic now, not Old Norse. Their guards, once Varangian mercenaries, were increasingly local-born. The Viking had become the noble, the raider had become the ruler, and the saga had turned into scripture. Yet the road from Kiev to Constantinople remained open, a golden artery pulsing with ship soldiers and silk. Norsemen still signed up for the Varangian Guard, drawn by tales of imperial glory and Byzantine gold. One of them, centuries later, would be a man named Harold Hardrada, destined to return west and die at Stamford Bridge as the last great Viking king. But for now, he was just a boy's legend waiting to be written. From fjords to forests, from the Baltic to the Bosporus, the Vikings had done something no other northern people ever achieved. They had become the bridge between worlds. They had turned rivers into roads, plunder into politics, and myth into monarchy. And in the candlelight of Kiev's churches, where Greek chants mingled with northern hymns, a new civilization was being born, half Scandinavian, half Slavic, wholly extraordinary. By the turn of the millennium, the Viking world was no longer a scatter of raiders and farmers. It was a chessboard of kings. The children of Odin had grown up, and their longships now carried not pirates, but princes. From the fjords of Norway to the flat meadows of England, crowns glittered where helmets once gleamed. At the center of this transformation stood Sweyn Forkbeard, a name that sounds like an insult, but belonged to one of history's most formidable men. Sweyn was the son of Harald Bluetooth, the Danish king who'd united Denmark and Norway under the banner of both the hammer and the cross. But Sweyn was less saint than storm. When his father's push toward Christianity became overzealous, Sweyn rebelled, dethroned him, and according to rumor, hastened Harald's journey to Valhalla by more direct means. Having secured Denmark's swine, turned his gaze westward. England, rich and fractured, was once again the irresistible target it had been in his ancestors' day. Though Alfred the Great had built a kingdom strong enough to survive the first Viking onslaught, time had worn England thin. The peace forged by Alfred's descendants had eroded into complacency. Its kings relied more on taxes than valor, and its coasts had grown careless. In the year 991, Sweyn's forces landed on English soil. The Battle of Maldon followed an epic clash immortalized in Old English verse. The poem praises Earl Byrhtnoth, who in a moment of chivalric generosity that must have made Odin groan, allowed the Vikings to cross the causeway onto solid ground before fighting. The result was carnage. Byrhtnoth was slain, and the English, bleeding and panicked, paid a ransom of 10,000 pounds of silver, the first of many Danegelds. To Sweyn, this was not just victory, it was business. Why conquer when you could tax from the comfort of your longship England paid? Denmark grew rich, and Sweyn returned again and again, each time collecting more silver, each time leaving England a little poorer and more afraid. But tribute is a tricky drug. It breeds resentment in the payer and hunger in the taker. When the English king, Ethelred the Unready, a man whose nickname tells you all you need to know, ordered a massacre of all Danes in England on St. Brice's Day. 1002. The balance shattered. Among the victims, legend says, was Sweyn's sister Gunhild, murdered while praying in a church. For the Vikings, vengeance was not a choice. It was oxygen. Sweyn assembled a fleet, unlike any seen since the great heathen army 2 centuries earlier. He descended on England like a winter storm, ravaging towns, burning churches, and laying siege to London itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's terse entries cannot hide the despair. Never before has there been such harm in this land. By 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard had achieved what generations of Norsemen only dreamed of. He conquered England outright. London submitted, and the English nobles swore allegiance to the Danish king. For the first time in history, the crowns of Denmark and England rested on one head, but fate, in true Viking fashion, refused to let triumph linger. 5 weeks after his coronation, Sweyn died. Suddenly some say of illness, others whisper of divine retribution. He left behind a kingdom and a legacy both precariously balanced. His son, Canute the Great, inherited not just his father's ambitions, but his intelligence. Canute was no brute conqueror. He was a strategist, a king who understood that ruling required more than the sword, it required theater. When Ethelred died in exile, and his son Edmund Ironside tried to reclaim the throne, Canute met him in battle across England. Their duel at Asandin in 1016 ended with Edmund wounded and exhausted. Instead of executing him, Canute offered peace, dividing England between them. It was a gesture of cunning mercy. Within weeks, Edmund died of his injuries, or perhaps of English politics, and Canute became sole ruler. He was only in his early 20s. Canute's reign was a paradox, a Viking king ruling over the very kingdom his ancestors had terrorized. Yet he managed it with brilliance. He maintained the old Danish power base, but embraced English customs law and church. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of Ethelred, uniting Viking blood with the lineage that would later produce the Norman conquerors. He issued laws in English-patronized monasteries and presented himself not as a foreign tyrant, but as the rightful protector of Christendom. Under Canute, the North Sea Empire took shape, a realm linking Denmark, England, Norway, and parts of Sweden and Scotland, all bound together by trade, tribute, and fear. The North Sea became his personal highway. Wherever the tide reached, his authority followed. But power, that vast, needed performance. Not keenly aware of how legends are made, staged one of history's most misunderstood moments, when his courtiers flattered him as a man so mighty he could command even the sea. He set his throne on the beach as the tide rolled in. "I command thee, sea, to go back," he said. "Then let the waves soak his feet. Let all men know," he told his followers, "how empty is the power of kings, for none is worthy of obedience save he who rules heaven and earth." Centuries later, the story would be twisted into arrogance, King Canute trying to stop the tide. In truth, it was the opposite, a Viking teaching humility to courtiers drunk on flattery. Canute ruled for nearly 20 years. Under him, England prospered. Trade flourished, piracy declined, and silver, once paid, as ransom now flowed through royal treasuries. He funded churches from Winchester to Lund, employing both English scribes and Danish smiths. His empire, though held together by personality more than structure, was the most stable Northern Europe had seen in generations. Yet even kings cannot outlast the sea. When Canute died in 1035, his sons fought bitterly over succession. The North Sea Empire, stitched together by one man's will, began to unravel. England slipped back into chaos, eventually falling under the sway of the Normans' descendants, ironically of Vikings, who had settled in France generations before. Still, for a shining moment, the dream had been real. A Viking sat on England's throne, ruled from the fjords to the fens, and proved that the raiders of the north could be rulers of civilization. The sword had become a scepter. The prow of the longship had become the crest of a crown. It was the apex of the Viking Age, a transformation from ferocity to governance, from wanderers to kings. But it was also a turning point. For with power came peace, and with peace came stillness, and stillness was something the sea-born Vikings had never quite learned to trust. Soon, new forces, faith, empire, and ambition would sweep across Scandinavia. The old gods were dying, and the kings who once sacrificed to Odin now knelt before the cross. The Viking world had conquered everything land, sea, and fear itself. But there was one realm it could not ignore forever, the realm of the spirit. By the 11th century, the sound of church bells was echoing across the same fjords that had once rung with war horns. The old gods, those rowdy, magnificent companions of Odin's hall, were fading like mist under a rising sun. In their place came the sign of the cross, the Latin tongue, and the peculiar new ritual of kneeling. This was the Christianization of Scandinavia, not a single event, but a long, uneven negotiation between sword and sermon, faith and politics. It was less a sudden conversion than a centuries-long merger, where religion became a form of real estate management and salvation a matter of royal convenience. At first, the idea of one God seemed absurd to people who had always trusted in many. The Norse pantheon was intimate and flexible gods who drank with you, lost their tempers, and occasionally needed rescuing. The Christian God, by comparison, seemed distant, invisible, and oddly humorless. But as the Viking kings grew more powerful and more connected to the wealthy courts of Europe, they began to see the cross not just as faith, but as infrastructure. Harald Bluetooth, the Danish king, who had built fortresses and runestones a generation earlier, was one of the first to make the leap. The famous Jelling stone raised in the 960s bears his proud declaration, Harald, who won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. That's the kind of humility only a Viking could bring to theology. Harald's baptism was partly political theater. The Holy Roman Emperor to the south, Otto Freyr, was growing interested in the lands beyond the Elbe. Conversion was a shield against conquest. A baptized king could negotiate instead of kneel, so Harald did both. He let the priests preach, built a few churches, and quietly kept his hammer amulet tucked under his shirt just in case. The process spread unevenly. In Denmark, it was orderly, almost bureaucratic. In Norway, it was chaos wrapped in scripture. Their conversion arrived by fire and oath under Olaf Tryggvason, a charismatic warlord with the zeal of a televangelist and the patience of a thunderstorm. Having spent time among Christians abroad, Olaf returned to Norway in 995, determined to baptize the nation by persuasion, where possible by acts where not. He traveled up fjords preaching peace, and then burned anyone who disagreed. Villages were offered baptism or execution. Pagan temples were torn down and replaced with churches. Idols of Thor and Odin were hacked apart and dumped into rivers. According to the sagas, when one chieftain refused to convert, Olaf tied a poisonous snake to his face until he changed his mind. The Viking Age had always been a little rough around the edges, but this was something new: salvation by coercion. And yet, for all his violence, Olaf's mission worked, at least partly. The image of Christ began to replace Odin in carvings and charms, though the two sometimes looked suspiciously alike. Old symbols endured beneath new names. Thor's hammer, subtly reshaped into a cross, the feasting hall, reborn as a church nave. Pagan festivals were repackaged as saints' days. Yule became Christmas. The gods didn't die so much as they changed clothes. Olaf's reign was short. He died in 1000 AD at the Battle of Svolder, ambushed by a coalition of rivals. But the work continued under his successor, Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf. Where Tryggvason had tried to convert Norway with fire, Saint Olaf used law. He established Christian codes, built bishoprics, and declared tithes. But even he was no gentle preacher. The sagas describe him as proud, headstrong, and terrifyingly pious. His rule sparked rebellion. Pagan farmers rose up against his taxes, and sermons seeing him not as a saint, but as a tyrant in holy disguise. In 1030, they met him in battle at Stiklestad, where Olaf was slain, struck down ironically by the very men he had hoped to save. And then came the twist worthy of a saga. The next year, miracles were reported at his grave, healings, visions, strange lights. The church canonized him, and suddenly the man his country had killed became the symbol that united it. Norway's conversion was complete, not by conquest, but by memory. Meanwhile, in Sweden, conversion took longer. The Swedes, practical to the end, hedged their bets. Kings like Olaf Skutkonung accepted baptism, minted coins with Christian symbols, and then built temples to the old gods anyway. Insurance, perhaps, against divine disappointment. At Uppsala, the great pagan sanctuary, sacrifices continued well into the 11th century. 9 animals, sometimes human, hung in the sacred grove. When the missionary Adam of Bremen wrote about it in 1070, he sounded both horrified and impressed, noting that the bodies of men and beasts hang together side by side. But the tide was turning. Christianity offered something even the gods could not: connection. A baptized king could marry foreign princesses, trade in Christian ports, and wield divine legitimacy instead of just personal glory. The church also brought literacy, the power to write laws, record history, and send letters that didn't rely on memory or rhyme. Gradually, priests replaced skalds as keepers of truth, and parchment replaced the rune stone. The old songs didn't vanish overnight. They were just rewritten, tamed. 1,000 years later, we would call them myth. For the people of Scandinavia, conversion brought both loss and stability. The restless fire of the Viking Age dimmed into the warm glow of Christendom. The longships that once carried raiders now carried pilgrims and merchants. The North entered the Middle Ages, not as a menace, but as a participant in the wider world. And yet, if you listen closely, the old voices never truly disappeared. They lingered in the wind, over the fjords, in the tales told by hearthlight, in the runes carved discreetly into church walls. The people might pray to Christ on Sunday, but they still muttered to Thor, before a voyage still buried silver for luck, still dreamed of Valhalla when the nights grew long. The new faith had conquered the North, but it had also been quietly conquered by it. Christianity in Scandinavia took on a northern flavor, austere, stoic, and tinged with fatalism. Even the saints seemed to carry a little Viking steel beneath their robes. The warships were gone, the temples silent, and the oaths now made before the cross. But the spirit that had sent men across oceans and continents, the refusal to stand still, the hunger to know what lay beyond, was not gone. It had simply changed form. If the Viking Age had to end, it would not go quietly. It would go with trumpets, with flame, with a man who embodied every contradiction of the North scholar and soldier pilgrim and conqueror poet and butcher. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, though history would remember him by a grander title, Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. He was born in Norway around 1015, a nephew of Saint Olaf, the very king who had dragged Norway into Christianity by the scruff of its pagan neck. Harald grew up amid the clash between the old and the new, between Odin and Christ Axe, and cross chaos and kingdom. He was only 15 when his uncle's army fell at Stiklestad, that infamous battle where Olaf was slain and sanctified. The boy fought there too, swinging a sword half his size, wounded, captured, and already tasting the bitterness of defeat. But Harald was not built to die in a swamp. He escaped eastward, following the old Varangian routes through Sweden, across the rivers of Rus, to the glittering city his ancestors had dreamed of, Constantinople. There, he reinvented himself. In the service of the Byzantine emperors, he joined the Varangian Guard, that elite corps of northern mercenaries who protected the imperial throne. Imagine him striding through marble halls, under mosaicked ceilings, his mail shirt glinting like fish scales under torchlight, his blue eyes scanning for threats in the emperor's court. To the Greeks, he was the embodiment of northern fury, 6.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and entirely too comfortable with chaos. The sagas describe his years in Byzantium as a blur of wars, intrigue, and adventure. He fought in Sicily, crushed rebellions in the Mediterranean, and may have even battled in the Holy Land. He rose through the ranks to become commander of the Guard, amassing both fortune and fame. But fame for Harald was never enough. He wrote poetry about his exploits. Yes, this towering Norse mercenary composed verse in his spare time lines that combined battle glory with the sensitivity of a man who could appreciate sunsets on the Aegean. Eventually, ambition burned brighter than loyalty. After a falling out with the emperor, Harald fled Constantinople, smuggling out his wealth in barrels of wine. One does hope he labeled them correctly. He returned north as a legend, richer than any jarl, sharper than any sword. In 1046, he joined forces with his nephew Magnus the Good, then King of Norway and Denmark. The alliance lasted about as long as a Viking summer. When Magnus conveniently died the next year, rumor points at Harald's subtle hand. The throne was his. Thus began the reign of Harald Hardrada, a king forged equally from exile and empire. He ruled with ruthless efficiency, part warlord, part administrator, part philosopher with a temper. He crushed rebellions, expanded trade, and strengthened the church, while privately admiring the old gods. He introduced Byzantine-style administration to Norway-minted coins with his image and turned Oslo, a mere trading post, into his royal seat. But peace was never his natural element. His heart still beat to the rhythm of oars. His empire in the north was stable, yes, but his eyes were fixed westward toward the one prize that eluded his predecessors, England. After Nut the Great's dynasty collapsed, England once again became a chessboard of claims and ambitions. The throne was held by Edward the Confessor, childless and indecisive. Every ambitious neighbor smelled opportunity. Harald Hardrada had a claim distant but not absurd, rooted in agreements between past kings of Norway and England. More importantly, he had ship's soldiers and that old Viking conviction that destiny favored bold men. In 1066, he set sail with around 300 longships, perhaps 10,000 men, his banners embroidered with ravens and crosses alike. His invasion force swept through northern England, with terrifying precision, crushing local armies and capturing York. For a moment, it seemed as though the age of the Vikings had returned. England bowed again to the dragon sails. But destiny, like the sea, can change in a heartbeat. King Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon ruler, marched his army north in record time, covering nearly 300 kilometers in 4 days. On September 25, 1066, the two forces met at Stamford Bridge near the River Derwent. The day was bright, the kind of sharp autumn morning that makes steel gleam. The battle that followed would be remembered as the full stop at the end of the Viking sentence. The sagas say a single Norse warrior held the bridge against the English for hours, cutting down dozens before being felled from beneath by a spear. It's likely myth, but it captures the spirit of the day, a hopeless, heroic defiance. Harold fought in the thick of it, towering above his men, clad in blue and gold, swinging his great two-handed sword. But as the tide turned, he lifted his visor to shout commands, and an English arrow found the exposed throat beneath his beard. The hard ruler fell. He died as he had lived, mid-battle, mid-shout, unbent. The defeat was total. Of the 300 ships that had sailed from Norway, only 24 returned. The Viking dream of England sank with him in the Derwent's cold waters. And yet, the irony of history is never far. Just weeks later, Harold Godwinson, victor of Stamford Bridge, would himself fall at Hastings, killed by another invader from across the sea, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, descendant of Vikings who had traded their axes for titles generations before. The Viking Age did not end with a death, but with a coronation, its blood transformed into blue. As for Harold Hardrada, his story did not fade. The skalds sang of him for centuries, the boy who fled a battlefield to conquer empires, the poet-warrior who straddled the worlds of Odin and Christ, the man who carried the last ember of the Viking fire. He was the last to embody what the North once was, a world where courage was currency, where a man's worth was measured by the stories told after he was gone. His death closed a door that had been open for 300 years. Behind it lay the old gods, the longships, and the wild, salt-scented freedom of an age that would never come again. But even as Europe drifted into feudal calm, the sea still whispered his name. On stormy nights, sailors swore they could see ghostly sails gliding over the North Sea, a golden-bearded king at their prow, still chasing the horizon that no man ever truly reaches. When Harold Hardrada fell at Stamford Bridge, an age died with him. The Viking world, the world of axes and oaths of gods who drank mead and kings who rowed their own ships, was gone. But its shadow lingered, stretched across Europe in new and unexpected forms. The Norsemen had stopped raiding. Now they were ruling. Ironically, their greatest conquest wasn't won by Harold's sword, but by a man descended from his kin, a Norman duke named William the Conqueror, born of Viking blood, long simmered in French wine. 2 centuries before Hastings, a group of Norse raiders had settled along the northern coast of France. Their leader, Rollo, was a shrewd and restless man, too ambitious to die a pirate, too practical to keep fighting for the same coastline every spring. In 911 AD, he struck a bargain with the Frankish king Charles the Simple, whose nickname suggests he got the worst end of most bargains. In exchange for peace, Rollo was granted land at the mouth of the Seine, a region that would soon bear his name, Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The deal was genius on both sides. Rollo promised to defend the realm from future Viking attacks, which conveniently meant from other Vikings. He converted to Christianity, married into the Frankish nobility, and began the slow transformation from sea-wolf to statesman. Within a generation, his descendants spoke French, prayed in Latin, and built stone castles instead of timber halls. But under the silk and ceremony, the old Viking fire still burned. By the 11th century, the Normans were Europe's most dangerous paradox-disciplined warriors, with Viking ferocity wrapped in the elegance of continental kingship. Their Duke William was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, a man with the temperament of a conqueror and the patience of a spider. When England's king, Edward the Confessor, died childless in 1066, William claimed the throne by distant blood and a conveniently vague promise. But another man, Harold Godwinson, the same who had slain Hardrada weeks earlier, had already seized the crown. William did what any sensible Norman or Viking would do. He built ships. That autumn, the winds changed, and so did history. William crossed the Channel with an army of knights archers and ambition. The Battle of Hastings was short, brutal, and decisive. Harold's army, already bloodied from fighting Hardrada, met William's disciplined ranks on Senlac Hill. Arrows filled the sky like migrating birds, and when Harold fell, legend says, an arrow to the eye, the crown of England fell with him. And so, in October 1066, a descendant of Vikings became King of England. It's hard to overstate what that meant. The land, once raided by Norsemen, was now ruled by their progeny. The same blood that had burned monasteries now sat on thrones, wore coronation robes, and issued decrees sealed in wax instead of blood. The transformation was complete. The wolves had not been tamed, they had evolved. Under William, England became a hybrid kingdom, Anglo-Saxon roots grafted to Norman ambition. Castles rose where mead halls once stood. The language of government became French, but the backbone of courage remained stubbornly English. The Domesday Book, a vast survey of William's new realm, was as methodical and unromantic as a Viking raid, except now the plunder was tax data. Across Europe, other Norse offshoots were doing the same. In Ireland, Norse Gaelic kings ruled Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, turning former pirate bases into bustling trade hubs. In Sicily and southern Italy, Norman knights, descendants of the same stock, built their own kingdoms, blending Latin administration, Greek culture, and Arab science into a melting pot of brilliance. In Byzantium, Norsemen still served as elite Varangian guards, wielding their axes in defense of emperors they could barely understand. The Viking world had gone global just quietly. Meanwhile, back in Scandinavia, kings were becoming bureaucrats. The descendants of Knut and Olaf ruled Christian monarchies tied to the wider European network of faith and diplomacy. The longship fleets had been replaced by standing armies, the sagas by law codes. Trade, not terror, became the way forward. The Danelaw, once a frontier between pagan and Christian, had melted into the English heartland. Norse names, Eric, Gunnar, Sigrid, were now carved beside Anglo-Saxon ones on gravestones. Words like sky window, husband, and law slipped into the English tongue gifts from a people who had learned that conquest could happen linguistically as well as militarily. And through it all, the Viking ideal persisted not as marauders, but as makers. They built cities, wrote chronicles, minted coins, and commissioned stone churches where runes once stood. The restless curiosity that had sent them across the Atlantic now drove them to codify laws and map their own world. Yet despite this metamorphosis, something remained a spark of the old defiance. When a storm hit, they still cursed with Odin's name. When an oath was sworn, it was still said with the same gravity that once bound raiders across oceans. Christianity might have rewritten the theology, but it never erased the temperament. Even in England, Norman kings carried that inheritance in their bones. William's heirs were as brutal as their ancestors. His son, William Rufus, died mysteriously while hunting in a forest, an arrow through his lung. His grandson, Henry II, ruled half of Europe, and his great-grandson, Richard the Lionheart, would lead crusades across the Holy Land. The lineage of Vikings had gone from looting abbeys to sacking Jerusalem. Across centuries, the Viking ambition endured, just dressed in better armor and Latin titles. And yet, for all their crowns and cathedrals, something had been lost. The sea no longer called to them as it once did. The shipyards were silent, the oar songs forgotten. The horizon, once a promise, had become a border. But every time the wind swept across the North Sea, carrying the cries of gulls and the smell of salt, perhaps some distant descendant of those first raiders felt an itch they couldn't name. The urge to move, to see, to take, to make. The Viking spirit, restless, inventive, undaunted, had not died. It had simply changed jobs. The age of raids was over. The age of kingdoms had begun. The Norse were no longer the terror of Europe. They were its architects. The axe had built the Viking world, but the pen would preserve it. By the time the last longships had rotted on their keels, something remarkable was happening in the north. The people who had once lived by raid and reputation had begun to live by memory. The same men who once settled disputes with steel were now settling them with words. Laws, sagas, and stories carved in stone, sung in halls, whispered over winter fires, became the new weapons of a people learning to outlast their own age. For centuries, Viking law had been a living thing, carried not in scrolls, but in the minds of men. Every district had its thing, the open-air assembly, where farmers and chieftains gathered to settle matters of inheritance, marriage theft, or murder. And at its heart stood the law speaker, a man whose job was to remember everything. Imagine him standing on a rock, before hundreds of listeners, cloak whipping in the wind, reciting pages of law from memory like an incantation. His voice would roll across the fjord, the rules of land division, blood price, and honor each clause sealed not by ink but by reputation. Forgetting a law was no small sin. It could mean the unraveling of justice itself. These laws were practical and poetic all at once. They valued fairness, but never forgot pragmatism. Compensation, vergild. The man price was favored over vengeance, not because it was moral, but because it was efficient. A feud could drain a family for generations. A payment could reset the world by morning. The Icelandic legal code, Gragas, written down in the 12th century, but rooted in far older custom, reads like a window into the Viking mind, meticulous, stubbornly reasonable, yet always aware that human tempers are unpredictable. It legislated everything from the division of whale meat to the proper punishment for witchcraft. For the record, 3 witnesses required exile, preferred burning optional. But law was only one part of the new order. Alongside it, something even more powerful was taking shape: literature. The Vikings, it turns out, were not content to disappear quietly into history. They wanted to explain themselves. And so, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the descendants of raiders began to write. On the volcanic island of Iceland, remote, wind-torn, and improbably literary scribes took up quills and began transcribing the oral stories that had been told for centuries. They wrote on calfskin, with ink made from soot and iron, preserving the memory of a world already slipping into myth. The result was the sagas, the heartbeats of a vanished civilization. These sagas were not simple hero tales. They were astonishingly human. They chronicled family feuds, outlaw adventures, voyages, betrayals, and the quiet tragedies of survival. Njal's saga, for instance, begins with a marriage dispute and ends with half of Iceland on fire. Egil's saga tells of a poet-warrior whose verses were as sharp as his axe, a man equal parts killer and artist. Laxdæla's saga spins a love triangle worthy of Shakespeare. Each saga was part history, part moral experiment. They didn't glorify violence so much as study it. A Viking audience listening to a skald recite by the hearth would nod at the wisdom beneath the bloodshed, that fate spares no one, that pride has a cost, that even heroes must reckon with their ghosts. The sagas were joined by the Eddas, poetic collections of myth cosmology and prophecy. Compiled in Iceland, these books became Europe's window into the Old Norse religion. The poetic Edda preserved the songs of Odin and Thor, of the world tree Yggdrasil, and of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The prose. Edda, written by the brilliant statesman Snorri Sturluson, turned these fragments into a coherent mythology. Without Snorri, we might never have known of Loki's mischief Baldur's death, or the serpent that encircles the world. It's a delicious irony the Vikings once feared for burning monasteries and libraries became the authors of some of medieval Europe's most intricate literature. Their descendants, once the illiterate terror of Christendom, preserved their pagan past with the patience of monks. And what they wrote was not nostalgia, it was identity. The sagas gave meaning to the transition from chaos to civilization. They were a bridge between the Viking world and the medieval one, between axe and crucifix. Through them, the North could remember without glorifying, mourn without surrendering. Even the writing itself carried echoes of the old runes. Long before parchment and quill, the Norse had used runestone slabs of granite carved with angular letters, often painted in red. Thousands still stand across Scandinavia, lining fields and churchyards. Some commemorate fallen sons or voyages abroad. Others are surprisingly humble. Gunvor made this bridge in memory of her husband Oyvind. May God help his soul. A bridge, a name, a prayer, simple acts of remembrance carved in stone, outlasting empires. In those inscriptions, you can feel the transformation complete. The same culture that once honored its dead, with ship burials now built bridges for their souls. The same hands that once gripped swords now held chisels. The Vikings had not vanished. They had translated themselves. Even their language endured. Old Norse, the tongue of skalds and kings, evolved into modern Icelandic, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish. English, too, still bears their fingerprints every time we say sky anger, husband window, or law. We speak with Viking ghosts in our mouths. By the 13th century, the old sagas had become national treasures, copied and recopied by scribes who likely didn't believe in Odin, but still admired him. When Europe rediscovered these texts centuries later, they would ignite the imaginations of romantic poets, archaeologists, and adventurers. From Wagner's operas to Tolkien's Middle-earth, the long shadow of the sagas still falls across modern myth, and somewhere perhaps that would have made the skald smile. The North had always believed that words could outlast death, that a name spoken was a life extended. That memory, if shaped well enough, could defy the end of all things. The Vikings didn't just conquer with swords, they conquered time itself. In the end, what remained of them was not the roar of battle, but the murmur of stories of gods and ghost lovers and lawmen, fools, and heroes. It is through those stories that we still meet them, not as barbarians, but as thinkers, dreamers, poets, and architects of the imagination. And if you listen closely, through the centuries of ink and silence, you can still hear the voice of the law speaker on the wind, calling out across the fields. Let it be known that no man is forgotten so long as his name is spoken. The Vikings left behind no pyramids, no marble cathedrals, no painted ceilings of angels and saints. Their artistry lived in smaller, more intimate places, on wood, bone, bronze, and stone objects meant to be touched, carried, and used. Yet within those objects lies an entire universe of beauty and belief, swirling like sea foam around the edges of eternity. When we speak of Viking art, we are really speaking of a language, one written not in letters, but in lines that twist, bite, and bloom. To look at a Viking carving is to read a story without words. Dragons devouring their own tails, serpents coiling through knots, animals melting into abstract shapes that seem half alive. It is a style that feels both mathematical and wild in art form, that, like the people who made it, balanced order and chaos in perfect tension. The earliest phase of this art, born in the migration period and maturing through the Vendel and Oseberg eras, looks almost hypnotic. Take the Oseberg ship burial discovered in 1904. Beneath a Norwegian mound, the ship itself, built around 820 AD, is a sculpture masquerading as a vessel. Its prow unfurls into a spiraling dragon's head, every curve alive with curling vines and interlaced beasts. Even the sled's buckets and tent poles buried within it are masterpieces, each etched with knotwork so delicate it seems to breathe. For these craftsmen, art wasn't a luxury. It was a conversation with the divine. Every swirl and pattern carried symbolic weight. Serpents and dragons, creatures of endless motion, stood for protection and transformation. The intertwining lines mirrored the Norse cosmos itself, a world where all things were connected from the roots of Yggdrasil to the stars above. As the centuries passed, Viking art evolved through distinct styles, each named for the place where it was found. The Bora style favored tight, symmetrical knots and gripping beasts, creatures biting their own borders, symbolizing eternity and self-containment. The Jellinge style, popular under Harold Bluetooth, introduced smoother lines and animal forms that seemed to dance rather than wrestle. The Mamen and Ringerike styles grew more ornate, merging Christian motifs with pagan curves, crosses nestled among serpents, vine scrolls flowing into Thor's hammer. And then came the Ørnes style, the final flourish of the Viking aesthetic. Named after the stave church at Ørnes in Norway, it is elegant, almost ethereal. The beasts are slender and elongated, their bodies weaving into graceful knots that seem more like calligraphy than carving. By then, Christianity had taken hold, but the old sensibility remained. The dragons and vines still whispered of Yggdrasil, even as they guarded a church door instead of a chieftain's hall. That's what makes Viking art so haunting. It adapted without surrendering. It absorbed Christianity not as a replacement for its own imagery, but as another color on its palette. The craftsmen, who once carved Odin's ravens, now carved angels' wings, but the rhythm of their hands never changed. Their tools still followed the same spirals, their imagination still curved toward eternity. Beyond metal and wood, the Vikings also left behind textiles, jewelry, and runes, each a fusion of function and beauty. Norse women, who managed households and wealth while their husbands were away, were also the keepers of textile art. The Oseberg find included tapestries, woven with scenes of processions and animals, their colors faint, but their meaning vivid. Brooches, buckles, and pendants were shaped like beasts or ships inlaid with silver and amber. Every item from a sword hilt to a comb bore decoration. Life itself was worth adorning. Even their writing the runes was a kind of visual poetry. Angular and severe, carved into wood or stone, each rune carried both a sound and a spirit. A single line of runes could be an epitaph, a prayer, or a curse. Some stones spoke softly. Torgun raised this stone in memory of her son, a brave man. Others were unapologetically proud. Ulfr has raised this stone and fed the ravens on the journey to England. To modern eyes, these inscriptions seem simple. To the Vikings, they were immortality carved into the earth. And then there was their architecture, a meeting of shipwright and priest. The stave churches of Norway, built in the 12th and 13th centuries, are perhaps the last living descendants of Viking craftsmanship. Their dark timbers rise like masts, their roofs layered like dragon scales. and their doorways alive with carved beasts and tendrils. Walk into one, and you feel as though you've stepped into a longship turned upright, its ribs transformed into pillars, its prow reaching for heaven instead of the horizon. If cathedrals were built to impress, stave churches were built to protect. They are intimate, wooden worlds, half temple, half forest. In their carvings, you can trace the moment where pagan myth and Christian faith shook hands. The serpents of Ragnarok coil around the crosses of salvation. The past and future breathe in the same wood grain. This merging of worlds also shaped how the North saw itself. When the Viking Age ended, its art did not die. It evolved into the visual DNA of Scandinavia. The same patterns that once adorned shields now danced on church doors, jewelry, and manuscripts. The medieval North was quieter, but it still moved to the old rhythm, flowing circular, never still. Even today, Viking art survives not just in museums, but in the texture of Nordic identity. In jewelry design, in tattoos, in folk ornamentation, in the way Scandinavian modernism still favors clean lines and organic forms. You can draw a direct line from an Oseberg carving to a modern Danish chair. Both understand that beauty lies in simplicity and structure. What makes Viking art so enduring isn't grandeur, it's intimacy. It speaks not from palaces, but from everyday life. It reminds us that even a warrior culture paused to decorate its tools, to tell its stories in the grain of wood and the shine of bronze. Their art, like their ships, was meant to move to carry something of themselves forward into time. And in that sense, it succeeded. Long after the gods fell silent and the longships vanished, the art of the North still whispers across 1,000 years, carrying the same message carved into so many rune stones. We were here. We built beauty from battle order, from chaos, and meaning from wood and wind. By the later centuries of the Viking Age, the North had begun to hum, not with the clash of swords, but with the chatter of markets. The same hands that once swung axes were now weighing silver dyeing cloth and counting barrels of salted fish. The Vikings had started as raiders, but they ended as merchants, and their towns, those living crossroads of sea and land, became the beating heart of a world in transition. Imagine the smell. First tar salt and smoke thick with the sweetness of mead and the tang of hides. You're standing in Hedeby, a bustling Danish port on the southern edge of Jutland. It's the year 1000 AD, and the place is alive. Ships crowd the docks, their hulls creaking under the weight of cargo. Traders shout in Old Norse, Old English, and Frankish. Dogs bark. Coins clink. Somewhere, a blacksmith's hammer rings like a heartbeat. This is not the Viking world of legend, the storm, and slaughter. This is the Viking world of exchange. Here you could find everything the age had to offer. Silks from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic soapstone, from Norway, walrus, ivory from Greenland, and silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, their Arabic inscriptions glinting like tiny prayers. Slaves, too, were traded in uncomfortable truth the sagas seldom mention. The Norse word thrall appears often in law codes, rarely in poetry. But their labor built these towns as surely as iron nails held the ships together. At its height, Hedeby was one of the largest cities in northern Europe, a melting pot of Scandinavians, Frisians, Saxons, and Slavs. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of artifacts from its mud beads, from Baghdad, glass from the Rhineland gaming pieces, and combs made from reindeer antler. Hedeby even had city planning, a semicircular rampart, a wooden pier, narrow lanes, lined with longhouses and workshops. You could buy honey or hire a mercenary without walking 50 steps, but Hedeby was just one pearl on a growing string. Across the north, new urban centers bloomed: Birka, in Sweden, Kaupang, in Norway, Jorvik, modern York, in England, Ribe, in Denmark. Each was a node in a vast network of trade that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from Ireland to Persia. In Birka, Swedish, merchants loaded longships with furs, iron and amber sailing down the Baltic to trade for silver and silk. In Jorvik, Viking, craftsmen hammered copper-tanned hides and brewed ale in wooden vats, while English monks across the river muttered prayers for deliverance from the Northmen. The irony was by then, the Northmen were probably their neighbors. In Ribe, rows of workshops churned out bone pins, brooches, and beads by the thousand. Artisans lived and worked side by side, silversmith next to weaver beside baker. Life was cramped, smelly, noisy, and thriving. What's most striking is how ordinary it all feels. For centuries, the Vikings have been imagined as perpetual warriors, but most lived quiet lives, filled with the same worries we recognize today: the harvest, the weather, the gossip of neighbors. The sagas, when read closely, reveal more about livestock than heroism. A line might read, Thorstein returned home for winter and repaired the roof. That was life. Their houses were long, low, and smoky rectangles of timber and turf with one central hearth. The entire family slept, ate, and worked in the same open hall, lit by the flicker of fire and the smell of stew. Benches lined the walls. Skins hung for warmth. In one corner, a loom stood where women wove linen and wool, their rhythmic clacking as steady as oars at sea. The household was a universe. The man might be away trading or fighting, but the woman was the axis on which everything turned. She managed property, labor, food, and finances. The key she wore at her belt wasn't decorative, it was authority. Women could inherit land, divorce husbands, and run farms. Their power was quiet, but immense. Outside, the seasons dictated everything. Spring was for sowing and ship repairs. Summer for sailing trade and raiding, depending on your job description. Autumn for harvest and feasts. Winter was for storytelling, weaving, and apparently litigation, since the cold kept people close enough to argue. Feasting was serious business. It reinforced hierarchy and community in equal measure. A good host served mead from horn cups, roasted meat, and bread baked on flat stones. Guests recited verses, wagers were made, and occasionally furniture was thrown. The sagas make it clear Norse hospitality was generous, but it came with rules. To leave a hall without offering thanks or to refuse a toast was social suicide. Underpinning it all was the thing system, those assemblies that had once been small tribal meetings and were now the backbone of governance. In Iceland, the Althing became a national parliament. In Norway and Denmark, regional things evolved into royal councils. Here, free men debated laws, settled disputes, and heard poets recite the news. The word thing, meaning assembly, survives today in languages like English something and modern Scandinavian parliaments, Stortingfolketing. Even politics, it seems, was a Viking export. Yet everyday life had its darker rhythms. Slavery persisted. Disease spread easily in close quarters. A poor harvest could mean famine. Superstition hovered over everything, carved amulets for luck charms, for safe childbirth runes scratched on doorframes to ward off evil. Christianity was spreading, but the old ways lingered stubbornly in the corners of daily life. A farmer might pray to Christ on Sunday and whisper to Thor on Thursday, hedging his bets like any good businessman. Children were taught early to be useful. Boys learned to handle axes and sail. Girls learned to spin, cook, and manage. Education was practical, oral, and steeped in proverb. Cattle die, Kindai the poet wrote, but the fame of a good man never dies. It was both a moral and a marketing slogan for an age obsessed with legacy. Even leisure was crafted with purpose. Board games, Ehinefetafel, a strategic cousin of chess, were popular, as were contests of strength poetry and riddles. Storytelling was everywhere entertainment, education, and moral compass rolled into one. Around the hearth, the sagas were rehearsed and reshaped nightly, growing like living organisms. By the 11th century, these towns and traditions had woven Scandinavia into the fabric of Europe. Longships that once carried raiders now carried goods. Bridges replaced fortresses. Market days replaced battles. Silver from the east mingled with coins from the west, and for the first time the Viking world was not feared, but courted. The North had entered its mercantile age. Its warriors had become traders, its explorers, diplomats, its poets, historians. In their quiet pragmatism, the Vikings had built something that no conquest ever could: continuity. And perhaps that was their greatest victory of all. Not the fleeting glory of fire and gold, but the simple, enduring hum of everyday life. People raising families, shaping wood, arguing about sheep, and passing on stories of their ancestors who once ruled the waves. The sagas may sing of gods and heroes, but the true soul of the North lived in these towns, in the smell of baking bread, the clang of a forge, the gossip at the market stall. It lived in the ordinary. And through that ordinariness, the Viking spirit survived long after the last longship sailed. The Viking world did not end with a crash, but with a sigh. No single battle or decree extinguished it. It simply faded slowly, beautifully, almost imperceptibly into the dawn of medieval Christendom. The roar of oars gave way to the toll of church bells, and the people of the North, who had once chased the horizon with fury in their eyes, began to build lives meant to last. By the 12th century, Scandinavia had changed beyond recognition. The longships that once lined the fjords were gone, replaced by fishing boats and trading cogs. The halls of chieftains had become manor farms, and wooden temples to Thor and Freyr had either been burned or repurposed as churches. On Sundays, the same voices that once shouted battle cries now murmured prayers in Latin. In Denmark, the descendants of Knut ruled over a realm of parishes and tithes rather than jarldoms and raids. Monks from Germany and England built abbeys on the sites of old pagan groves. Stone churches rose along the coastlines where raiders had once set sail. Their architecture, sturdy, simple, unadorned, spoke of a culture that had finally learned to stay still. Norway followed a similar path. The sagas tell of King Sigurd the Crusader, who a century after Harald Hardrada's death led ships south, not to raid, but to Jerusalem. His fleet carried banners marked not with ravens, but with crosses. Where Hardrada had sought earthly crowns, Sigurd sought heavenly favor. Yet in both men ran the same restless blood. Sweden, too, found its rhythm in the new order. Its great pagan sanctuary at Uppsala, once the heart of Norse religion, became a cathedral. The Christian bishops there wore embroidered robes, where once priests had worn furs, but they still oversaw the same gatherings, the same feasts of midsummer and harvest, only now the names of saints replaced those of gods. It was continuity disguised as conversion. But faith alone didn't reshape the North. Economics did. Silver from the caliphate had dried up as Islamic trade routes shifted. Raiding had grown politically impossible, piracy spiritually unfashionable. The new wealth came from commerce, agriculture, and the church's vast landholdings. A network of monasteries and bishoprics now connected Scandinavia to the intellectual bloodstream of Europe. Latin texts arrived, and with them, literacy spread beyond Iceland's poets and clerks. The law speaker gave way to the scribe, the rune carver to the priest, the saga to the chronicle. Yet something stubborn in the Norse soul resisted being fully tamed. Even as Christian kings reigned, they still ruled in the old-style peripatetic courts, traveling between feasting halls accompanied by poets, warriors, and jesters. They might end their letters with De Gratia Rex King, by the grace of God, but they still expected loyalty to be bought with meed, and generosity, not sanctity. The church had replaced Valhalla with heaven, but to a Viking's mind, both were reward for courage and endurance. In Iceland, the last truly independent remnant of the Old World, the transition was particularly poignant. The island's Althing voted to accept Christianity in the year 1000, a practical decision to avoid civil war. The conversion decree allowed people to worship the old gods privately as long as they didn't make public sacrifices. And so they did Christianity in the streets, Odin in the heart. For generations, the two faiths coexisted quietly, their boundaries blurred by the northern snow. But as the centuries passed, Iceland became the custodian of the memory of it all. While the mainland built cathedrals, Iceland built libraries, if not in stone, then in vellum. Monks and scribes recorded the sagas, the Eddas, the genealogies of kings and farmers alike. They preserved not only the myths, but the manners, jokes, and wisdom of a vanished world. That is why, paradoxically, the age of Christianity is also the reason the Viking Age was remembered. Without the monasteries' ink and discipline, the stories of Odin and Thor, of Sigurd and Brynhild, of Ragnar and his sons might have vanished with the smoke of the last hearth. The conquerors of Europe were saved from oblivion by the very religion they once tried to destroy. The physical evidence of their transformation still stands today. The staved churches of Norway, dark wooden marvels rising from pine forests, are half-pagan, half-Christian creatures. Their dragon-headed gables snarl at the sky relics of an older faith guarding the new. Step inside, and you smell the tar and wood smoke that have seeped into the walls for nearly 1,000 years. The space feels like a ship turned upright, its ribs transformed into arches. The Vikings may have stopped sailing the sea, but their churches still sailed toward heaven. And though the old gods fell silent, their presence lingered everywhere in language, landscape, and law. Thursday still carried Thor's name. Wednesday belonged to Odin, and the world still turned according to the rhythms the Norse had measured long before they met the cross. In time, the North became not a frontier, but a frontier maker. The same seafaring impulse that had once sent longships to raid monasteries now sent merchants to found trading posts, missionaries to the Arctic, and explorers toward the New World. The Viking spirit had become the Scandinavian spirit, disciplined, creative, quietly daring. Even as Europe forgot the terror of the Northmen, it inherited their courage. The medieval sailor, the Renaissance merchant, the modern adventurer, all carried a whisper of that old restlessness. The saga simply changed languages. If you had stood in a Scandinavian village around the year 1200, you might not have recognized it as the descendant of the Viking world. The people prayed to Christ. Their children learned Latin hymns. Their kings corresponded with Rome. Yet in the evenings, as the fire crackled, the old sagas were still told of Sigurd slaying the dragon of Helgi, and Hrothgar, of a one-eyed god who sacrificed himself for wisdom. The children would listen wide-eyed, not realizing they were hearing their own mythology turned into history. This, then, was the final triumph of the Viking spirit. Not conquest, not gold, but continuity. They outlived their own extinction by becoming the foundation of something new. The longships slept beneath the earth. The swords rusted. The gods were gone. But the people endured. And the sea, always the sea, kept whispering reminders. In that murmur, perhaps you can still hear the echoes of oars and laughter, the hum of wind in rigging, and the ancient northern promise that every ending is just another voyage waiting to begin. Centuries passed. The world the Vikings had once ruled fell silent, its halls buried beneath fields, its ships turned to soil. The old stories lingered only in whispers, half-remembered names, fragments of runes and sagas copied in monastery script that few could still read. The sea still beat against Norway's cliffs, but the longships no longer answered. Europe had forgotten the Vikings, or perhaps chosen to, until one day the earth began to speak. It started quietly in the late 17th and 18th centuries when farmers plowing their fields in Denmark or Sweden struck stone where no stone should be. They unearthed runestones, their surfaces carved with spiraling letters and curling beasts. Some bore crosses, others dragons, and beneath the lichen, people began to read again the voices of the dead. Asmund raised this stone for his brother who died in the east. Gunnlaug built this bridge for the soul of her husband. Each inscription was a heartbeat returning after 1,000 years. The 19th century brought a fever for the past. Romanticism swept across Europe like a second dawn, and suddenly the Vikings, those half-forgotten pagans from the north, were no longer barbarians. They were poets, heroes, symbols of freedom and raw human will. Painters filled canvases with stormy seas and horned helmets, the latter, of course, pure artistic invention. Composers like Wagner turned Norse myths into thunderous operas. Poets filled their verses with Odin's wisdom and Thor's hammer. And then the archaeologists came. In 1880, Norwegian farmers near Tønsberg dug into a burial mound and uncovered what would become one of the most astonishing finds in world history, the Oseberg ship. 70 feet of oak, carved like a dragon and buried under clay, almost perfectly preserved. Inside lay the remains of 2 women, one elderly, one younger, along with wagons, sleds, tapestries, carved animal heads, and household treasures. It was a time capsule of the Viking Age, as though the past had decided to keep itself safe for later. The Oseberg find stunned the world. For the first time, people could see the Vikings as they had seen themselves, builders of beauty, not just bringers of war. Soon after came the Gokstad ship, sleek and battle-ready, then the Tun ship, then dozens more from Norway's coastal mounds. Each hull pulled from the soil like a ghost rising from the deep. Each artifact a comb, a shoe, a carved sleigh was a whisper of everyday life reborn. The idea of the Viking changed forever. No longer were they simply marauders. They were navigators, craftsmen, explorers, the first global citizens of the medieval world. The 20th century brought New Diggs Ladby, where a chieftain was buried in his ship beside his horses. Birka, the Swedish trading port, whose graves revealed women buried with swords and merchants with scales. Jorvik, modern York, where entire Viking streets were unearthed, still smelling faintly of leather and tar. And then there was Lonso Meadows, discovered in 1960 on the tip of Newfoundland, an unassuming cluster of turf ruins that turned out to be the oldest known European settlement in the Americas. For centuries, Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland had been treated as myth. Now, archaeologists could hold it in their hands. Iron nails, spindle whorls, a forged proof that the sagas had told the truth. It was as if the sea had decided to return its secrets. By the mid-20th century, Viking studies had become a science. Excavations mapped trade networks stretching from Dublin to Baghdad. DNA analysis began to reveal what sagas only hinted at, that the Viking world was astonishingly diverse. The Viking was not a single race, but a tapestry Scandinavian, Celtic, Slavic, Baltic, even Middle Eastern threads woven together through trade, travel, and marriage. And with that discovery came a humbler truth. The Viking Age had never been one thing. It had been a symphony of contradictions, raiders and traders, poets and pirates, destroyers and builders. Their legacy was not just in conquest, but in connection. As scholars and storytellers reassembled that legacy, the North found itself reborn again in the modern imagination. Museums rose where burial mounds had slept. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland turned their Viking past from embarrassment to emblem symbols not of savagery, but of exploration, endurance, and artistry. Tourists now stand in front of the Oseberg ship in Oslo's museum, hushed as though before an altar. The carved prow gleams under soft light, its dragon head still curling toward the sky, as if impatient for the next voyage. The air smells faintly of pine tar and reverence. In that moment, you understand this was never a relic of violence. It was a love letter to the sea, to craft, to life itself. Even language carries the echo. In English, Norse words still ride our speech, like quiet stowaways, sky law, anger window will husband. They remind us gently that the Vikings never really left. They simply became part of everyone else's story. And perhaps that is the greatest rediscovery of all. The Viking Age was not some distant alien time, but an early chapter of the modern one, a time when the world's edges were still soft enough for courage to redraw them. Today, scholars continue to uncover fragments, a brooch here, a sword there, a rune scratched into a piece of driftwood. Each find is a conversation with ghosts. Each discovery peels back another layer of the myth to reveal something truer, more human. For the truth is, the Vikings were not gods or monsters. They were people, messy, magnificent, curious, flawed. They built, they destroyed, they loved, they grieved. They left behind no empire, but they changed the shape of the world all the same. Now 1,000 years later, the north is quiet again. The fjords mirror the sky, the winds hum through the grass, and the old burial mounds sleep under wildflowers. Yet the imagination they sparked still sails on. Every explorer, every scientist, every restless traveler who looks at a horizon and feels the itch to move owes something to them. Because the Viking spirit was never really about war. It was about motion, about refusing to stay still. And though their ships rest in museums, their journey is still unfinished, carried forward every time someone asks, as they once did, under the northern stars. What lies beyond? More than 1,000 years have passed since the last Viking longship slipped beneath the waves, its sails lowered and its oars gone still. Yet the legacy of those sea wolves, those restless children of wind and water, has never truly faded. It lingers in the way we imagine courage, in the way we name our days, and even in the way we dream about distant shores. The Vikings were never just a people. They were a moment, a spark of daring that burned through the dark of the early medieval world and refused to die out. Their age may have ended, but their spirit was too stubborn for burial. We see it first in the landscapes they left behind. The fjords of Norway still carry the memory of their prows, sharp and patient against the horizon. The burial mounds, quiet, under moss and birch still guard treasures of faith and ambition. Every rune carved into stone, every twisted ornament on a stave, church door still hums with the same pulse. We were here. We endured. Their influence seeped far beyond the north. The English language still hums with Norse syllables, sky egg window law, anger take. Everyday words, ordinary and unassuming, yet born from an age of steel and salt. Their descendants through the Normans reshaped England, France, and Sicily. The political geography of medieval Europe still traces faint outlines of Viking ambition. Even the modern idea of the North, rugged, free, inventive, pragmatic, owes its character to them. But perhaps the deeper legacy is not carved in maps or language. It is carved in the imagination. When we picture the Viking, we picture freedom, the refusal to kneel before fear. We imagine a people who looked at the sea not as a barrier, but as a bridge, who built ships delicate enough to dance over waves and strong enough to cross oceans. We imagine that moment of first contact, a sail rising over an English monastery, or a stranger stepping onto an American shore 5 centuries before Columbus. The image endures because it touches something universal, the hunger to go further. Their descendants, too, carried that flame forward. The Norse world became the modern Nordic nations: Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, a cluster of small countries that would one day punch far above their weight in art exploration and thought. From the seafaring traders of the Hanseatic League to the polar expeditions of the 19th century, from the sagas of medieval Iceland to the novels of Ibsen and Hamsun, the same impulse echoes curiosity, independence, and an almost religious respect for endurance. Even in faith, the old ways survived quietly woven into Christian fabric. Norse fatalism became Northern Stoicism. The belief that courage could defy doom turned into a cultural backbone hardship, faced with humor, misfortune, met with calm. In the modern Scandinavian ideal of lagom balance moderation, living well within one's means, you can still glimpse the shadow of the old thing, assemblies where justice depended on fairness and words rather than fury. And what of the myths? They never really went away. The gods of Asgard, Odin, Thor, Loki, Freya, outlived the men who carved them. They slipped into poetry, and folklore resurfaced in Wagner's operas and exploded again in modern imagination. Marvel's comic book Thor, for all his cinematic lightning, is just a modern echo of the thunder that once shook Viking hearts. Our fascination with apocalypse, with worlds that burn and rise again, comes straight from Ragnarok. Even our heroes, flawed and mortal, but unyielding, owe a debt to the Viking saga. The rediscovery of Viking history in the 19th and 20th centuries reshaped not just northern pride, but global myth-making. The longship became a symbol of exploration, the dragon prow a shorthand for human daring. Schools taught sagas as moral tales. Nations adopted runes for sports teams, museums for logos, tech companies for names. Viking became a shorthand for boldness, the willingness to leave harbor without a map. Yet beneath the modern romance lies a quieter truth. The Vikings were not gods of war, but craftsmen of survival. They lived in one of the world's harshest climates and turned hardship into culture. They navigated the most unpredictable sea on Earth, using nothing but instinct and starlight. They built communities in places others would have called uninhabitable. Their true genius was not destruction, it was adaptation. When the world changed, they changed with it. When gods fell, they wrote their stories down. When raiding failed, they turned to trade. When war grew costly, they built laws instead. Few civilizations have reinvented themselves so completely and left so deep a mark. And that perhaps is the real legacy of the sea wolves, the courage to evolve. Every age has its frontiers, new oceans, new worlds, new ideas, and every generation needs its Vikings people willing to set sail when others build walls. Their story reminds us that the map is never finished, that comfort breeds silence, and that curiosity is older than civilization itself. So when we speak of the Viking spirit, we are not talking about conquest or cruelty. We are talking about movement, about refusing to let the known world be enough, about daring to believe that something waits beyond the next wave. Tonight, as the North Sea sleeps under a silver sky, and the aurora curls like green fire over the horizon, imagine the sound of oars, again the steady rhythm of hands and hearts in motion. Somewhere in that rhythm, the Vikings are still sailing, not as raiders, not as kings, but as an idea, as that part of the human soul that cannot stop seeking the edge of the world and keeps rowing always toward the light beyond it.